of History of Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. Um, as advertised, we're doing part three. I got a little bit behind, so we're going to end it a little bit early. We're going to be covering chapters. Let me look up. We're going to be covering chapters 27 to 40 tonight. I have a short introduction. I want to thank two people in particular. I want to thank Caleb Maupin for suggesting the material, and the Center for Political Innovation has published its first book, which is a reprint of Gaddafi's Green Book. Small. There's a very good introduction by Caleb Maupin, and it really exposes the crimes of the U.S. against the people of Africa and the success that Gaddafi had building socialism in Africa. It's available on Amazon. The other person I want to thank for I don't have. Do I have his book with me? Oh, here it is. Is for the format. The idea of doing a live co-hosted study is based off of Matt Cedillo with his study of Capital that he named the Poet and the Professor, which he allowed for me to host. You can go back and watch that study there. And he does that study live on his Facebook page. And he has this great book of revolutionary poetry, Mowing Leaves of Grass, largely from a Chicano perspective. Great stuff. So we're just going to get right into it. I have a short introduction. The Third International, this is the exciting part. We went through the First International. We went through the Second International. We're on the Third International. This is when things happen. That was the buildup to now. Like was it Lenin said that sometimes years happen, decades happen in days or years or what have you. Everyone's been saying that quote. This is when it happens. So I have a little bit of an introductory speech. I'm just going to read.
Yep. And just before I carry on, good morning to everyone from Australia. And obviously, too, I've got my coffee in a cup with unnamed diet beverage, an essential item for every revolutionary process. Thank you, Caleb.
All right. When we go out into our communities and talk about socialism, we're often told that socialism has never accomplished anything. It has always resulted in nothing but mass poverty and death. Well, the Soviet Union had great accomplishments, not only in regard to theory and understanding, as shown with J.V. Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, but material accomplishments that can be seen today internationally. The Soviet Union went from the most backward country in Europe to an industrial superpower in a matter of decades through a succession of 5-year plans that showed unprecedented growth in industry, electrified the country, built up industry, vast improvement in people's material conditions and waising. This is the example that socialism works and historically, and it works better than capitalism. This is a time of the Great Depression, which we're going to go into later. Why capitalism was failing, the Soviet Union was building up industry, raising people out of poverty. These achievements were mimicked by the West. FDR, the Soviet Union built dams and electrified. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with pressure from communists, built the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority gave electricity to Appalachia and parts of the South They didn't have it before. And this was largely from inspiration of the Soviet Union and people here fighting in the United States, inspired by the Third International, helped build up great and beautiful things right here in the United States. Because of the Soviet Union, we still feel those effects today. The push for social security in the United States was pushed by communists here, inspired by the Third International. I'm going to start today. I'm going to attempt. This section is absolutely inspiring to this day. They've had accomplishments there that just unprecedented growth, like what we want more than ever. What we're trying to achieve as socialist organizers, they achieved. So I'm going to sing. I'm going to attempt to sing Paul Robeson's great African American revolutionary. Supported the Soviet Union, felt like a full human being for the first time in the Soviet Union, wrote a English translation of the Soviet national anthem, which I'm going to attempt to sing. It's actually interesting that Paul Robeson actually demanded that he pay royalties to the Soviet Union for the ability to sing this song, out of respect for the Soviet Union. All right, I'll go right into it. United forever and friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, a dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in our friendship, tried by fire. Long may a crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. Through days dark and stormy, the great Lenin led us. Our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above, and Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build up the land that we love. We fought for the future, destroyed the invader, and brought to our homeland the laurels of fame. A glory will live in the memory of nations, and all generations will honor her name. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hands. Long live her people, united and free, strong in our friendship, tried by fire. Long may a crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. All right.
Well done. I like that. Actually, that's a really good anthem. It was just before we go ahead, there's a little for all the viewers. There's a few years ago, I saw this on Facebook, I think, but it was on YouTube. I don't know if it's still there. It was the Russian soccer team or football team, and obviously before every game they all sing the national anthem. Well, it wasn't the current. The music they played, the people who organised the national anthem actually played the old one you just sang there, and it's just seen the enthusiasm of the Russian team and everyone in the crowd, the supporters and all that. It was actually loudly and proudly sang that song. It shows you how much of an influence and how much they only missed the Soviet Union. So there you go.
So do you have a response to the introduction? A few introductory notes or a response to what I
Well,
just said?
yeah, I think it's a very important epoch in human history, especially for working class. And really, it was the first time in a historical scale like that had ever achieved in one country. And obviously, before then, you had back in the early 1870s, the Paris Commune. They had in one city. Obviously, now this expanded into one mighty country. And there also, understand too, there was also experiments at utopian socialism, which completely collapsed everywhere. I'll give you an example, especially for those Australian audiences, but for around the world. Back in late, I think 1899, early 1900, there was a ship that set sail from Sydney Harbour called the Royal Tar, and on it was all these early utopian type socialists. They wanted to form a new country. They actually went sail to South America and formed what we call a commune or a communist utopia in Paraguay called New Australia. Obviously, from the outset, there were a lot of problems there. They split. One group formed what we call Cosmic. At the end of the day, it really sort of fell apart because it wasn't actual building a proper economic basis and developing a superstructure. It was more or less just on a utopian ideal. And unfortunately, a few it collapsed, but some came back to Australia. One person, William Lane, he actually wound up being a conservative media commentator in New Zealand. And he came back and just want to also address that a lot of the descendants of that still live in Paraguay today. Although they say identify a little bit of being coming from Australia, and that's where they are now. And most of their first language is Spanish. But they do speak white English. And I watched some interviews of very elderly people from there, and they had a very unique accent. Australian accent. I think it led to believe in some of the early forms of early Australian accent. But anyway, without going too far off track, that's going back to this, why it was such an historical epoch. It actually played a massive influence in the labour movements of a lot of the country, especially here in Australia. It certainly was an inspiration for all revolutions. Straight after, as we'll go through, there'll be explained there was other revolutions happening within the following year. And how it just united the working class and how it became a good threat to capitalism. And obviously, as we go through the last chapter of the Third International, it's certainly its defeat of fascism. It played a pivotal role in that, and also played a pivotal role in both our countries, America, US, and also Canada and New Zealand, about our living standards as well. Without the Soviet Union, there was a lot, actually, us workers, we've got to be, we wouldn't have certain rights and conditions we wouldn't have. We've got to be very thankful for them as well. So they played a massive role and influence. So I'll leave it back to you. I don't want to waste up time.
We'll start on the first section of part 3.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't write down page numbers.
190.
Okay. All right, we're starting on page 190 for those following along. The Zimmerwald movement, 1915 to 1917. This is really going into the period that was kind of between the Second International and the Third International. It was really the beginnings of the Third International was the Lenins and the Bolsheviks, which we talked about earlier in part 2. Lenin declared the Second International treasonous to the socialist cause when it supported the First World War. They called for anti-war forces to Lenin had a revolutionary idea of using the anti-war movement, the mobilization of the workers, to overthrow those fusions of feudalist and capitalist power at the time period. Lenin was in exile and made a manifesto that went on later to influence the Third International, and it actually resulted in further suppression of the Bolsheviks in Russia at the time. But I think this core idea that Lenin was pushing is really what we're going to talk about in this section. He was pushing for the anti-war movement to go into a revolutionary movement, and then a various amount of people, of opportunists and petty bourgeois forces suppressed this this notion. There was socialist anti-war conferences in this period, although not as revolutionary. There were many forces opposed to the war, including there was a women's conference that Clara Zetkin and Lenin's wife attended. This reminds me of the power of women in the anti-war movement, particularly the American anti-war hero Cindy Sheehan has been a leader here in the United States within the belly of the beast, appealing to the victims of war, the mothers and of the soldiers and the soldiers themselves nowadays. And I thought it was a good correlate. There was also a youth conference, which also didn't go as far. I'll keep going. The first Zimmerwald conference was held in Switzerland. Lenin led the charge to adopt revolution, but was voted down. Lenin later called the Zimmerwald movement the germ of the Third International. I'm probably not going to pronounce this right. The Keenthal Conference. This went a little bit closer, but they still didn't adopt the revolutionary ideas of Lenin. There was still bourgeois opposition and opportunist opposition to having the anti-war movement go into socialist revolution. There's also the Irish Rebellion of 1916. The Irish took advantage of the British fighting the Germans. The Irish rose up, but it was ultimately put down. And this was the end of. They actually assassinated. James Connolly, a great Irish revolutionary. Really did work in understanding on the national question. He fought so hard, he was wounded, and he had to prop himself up against something to be shot. He didn't want to be shot laying down. He was so wounded, he had to prop himself up to be shot like a man. Courageous figure. And they saw the opportunity. The Irish saw the opportunity to mobilize when the British were weak, but it also, there's no way of telling what happened. It was ultimately suppressed, and a great leader was assassinated. Lenin's great theoretical struggle. Lenin led the push for revolutionary anti-war action and had political struggle with Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and pushed for an underground party. Kautsky would push revolutionary phrasing and right-wing actions. Doesn't that sound familiar to a lot of these groups like Amazon? The publisher, the big behemoth publisher, will have Black Lives Matter on its site when they're literally killing workers in their factories, poor black and brown workers, because they won't give them adequate protection. We'll have Black Lives Matter. So Kautsky, this is nothing new for revolutionary phrasing and conservative and counter-revolutionary actions. And Lenin really was the leader in this time period. He was the leader of the world workers' revolution and understanding. And so much material that was written in this time period. There was so many forces. Like, he documented every time he had an ideological struggle or a debate with someone that is affecting that struggle. He wrote it down and explained it and published his position. And we can go back and read that today, and it's still important and necessary to our cause. This was the developing of Marxist-Leninism, which is a powerful tool of scientific socialism in the imperialist time period. Lenin published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
Yes.
In the time period, like in the midst of right before the Bolsheviks, well, the bourgeoisie took power, and then the Bolsheviks eventually took power. Right in this time period, in the opposition to World War I, he wrote the great work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. If you have not read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, I highly recommend it. It is still true to this day. Yeah. And the idea that I'm just going to go briefly over his understanding of it. It is monopolies, particularly finance capitalists, who grow power to an extent they have to compete with other imperialist powers. That was World War I, and that's the idea of imperialism, and that's still what we're struggling against today. Are these monopoly forces that have control over these our countries, and they continue these wars that have nothing to do with the workers' interests.
No, that's right.
Okay. Do you have any response to Section
27? I think it also understand imperialism. It requires that most of the world is poor. It's able to dump its products anywhere. Requires majority everyone living in poverty and destitution, under oppression, and that's imperialism. And I think what we're seeing now, we've heard the modern term globalization. Now it's obviously a lot more modernized. We've now the proletariat, or the working class, is being replaced now by the robot, by the microchip now, and further more people are pushed into poverty and destitution, etc. And it's good to actually always keep that in mind. And we've got to look at imperialism back then when Lenin wrote that, they were competing empires. Now, it's now a globalized world where we're seeing it. And it's also this is where we've got to be very careful not to deviate from Marxism and over either a right opportunist or a left or ultra left deviation, where I've heard the term that social imperialist, especially applied to China. Wrong. It's not. It's China lifts people out of poverty, and it wants to treat every country with respect and equal win-win basis. That's not imperialism. Imperialism requires the other countries to be completely knocked out and for their markets to be taken over, and for their population to be left poor, and they can dump all their products there. So it's certainly. I think we've got to be very careful. I think all comrades have got to make sure they're clearly understanding what it is, and seeing deviating from what Lenin wrote there was it's only going to lead you up into a dead end path of philosophical confusion. And I think it's vitally important we always keep clear. Well, Lenin wrote that quite clearly what it is, what imperialism is, and we apply it today. And we've actually seen now the whole system's in crisis. So what we're comparing today, and our struggle against it as well. So it's a worldwide struggle against it, more and more. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll go on to number 28. Okay, number 28 is the Russian Bourgeois Revolution, March 1917. Now, prior to the Revolution of October or November, it depends on which calendar you look at, of that year, obviously there was a bourgeois revolution. There was mass. They were actually then opposed to the war. On the front war against Germany, there was massive casualties. There was a lot of massive losses of territory. It was just basically going south for everyone, for the imperialists of that country. And obviously with the slogans like "Down with the Tsar," "Down with the war," "We want bread," obviously the Petrograd troops refused to fire on the people, and by evening 60,000 of them had joined with the demonstrators. So you can see all the conscripts and that everyone was just tired of all the prevailing conditions at the time. They wanted change, and the material conditions at that time was pretty desperate. It's how can I describe it? And obviously, we're moving by the second part of the revolution took place, but there was what we look at now. That first part of that revolution, it was a vital lesson learned for both the working class and the peasantry, in order to learn. For them to learn and be well organised for the next part of the socialist revolution. So it was the overthrow of the Tsar at the time, and they had the provincial government of Kerensky. And the problem we had, the thing is, they still, but it was the capitalists came to power, but the capitalists could not provide any way forward to provide for the people and their demands. Capitalism was still incapable of doing it. So when we look at why the revolution took place and then later on that year, well, I like this little paragraph here, and I best describe the material conditions. And this is also a reminder of what's primary matter and the idea. So material conditions determine will determine people's ideas and that. So I'll just read this out. Confronted by a savage semi-feudal autocracy, the Russian working class was especially class conscious and revolutionary, characteristics which were given direction and accentuated by the work of the brilliant Bolshevik leader Lenin. The workers slaved 11 to 13 hours per day for destitution wages. They were tyrannised over in the shops. They had no right to organise industrially or politically, and their strikes and other protest movements were met with bloody repression. The jails were full of working class fighters. The peasants faced an equally harsh regime. They were systematically robbed of their lands. They were taxed to death, and they were in the grip of iron-fisted assurers. And both workers and peasants, when the government saw fit, were drafted by the millions to die on the battlefields in the imperialist service of the Tsar. The many nationalities making up the Russian people were also subjected to ruthless oppression. And periodically, savage pogroms were directed against the Jews. The Orthodox Church was completely identified with this whole monstrous system of robbery and oppression. Yeah, understand that this is all the background to it, and obviously the workers were developing a very big class conscience. That was obviously with the leadership of Lenin, and what the role of the party was back then was to actually help them understand lift their consciousness as a class, that they're the ones that seize power. And we move on, and it certainly during that time, but it wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, okay, everyone go hip hip hurrah, we'll grab our arms and off we go and overthrow everything. It didn't happen that way. It was certainly it was a real brutal thing. And obviously, when we talk about revolution and that, and obviously peaceful or armed revolution, look, I would actually advise we try and do everything peaceful, use what avenues we can. What important. I think if you go around wishing for armed revolution, well, your wish will be granted. It is bloody. It is ruthless. It was only at that time why they used revolution, because they were being oppressed themselves in a very tyrannical manner. They had no choice but to do it. But if we the choice, we can look at changing society in a lot more peaceful manner. And with the revolutionary program of the party and the peaceful road to revolution, and we're also talking about the reactionary provisional government. Well, we can just see. I'll just go for the reactionary provisional government first. And well, understand why did they? You think they would have been? Some people actually asked the question once: why couldn't they be more progressive? Would have been a much more progressive forward than having the Tsar. Of course, naturally, it knocked out a feudal system. However, they were only there maintaining a certain power for an oppressing class, and that would have been the capitalist class or an exploiting class. Apologies. And obviously, the provincial government was reorganised in May as a coalition government made up of constitutional Democrats, now the Cadets, the main bourgeois party, Mensheviks, and the Socialist Revolutionaries. Its program was to conserve the interests of the capitalists and landlords and to balk the revolutionary demands of the workers and peasants. This was quite in harmony with the general line of the right-wing revisionists of the Second International. So they weren't interested about advancing the working class and peasant interests forward at all. That's what they wanted to maintain. But obviously, as the conditions worsened in that country, they couldn't maintain that power. At that time, Lenin once understood that this was the only first stage of the struggle. In his letters from afar, he told the revolution workers that sooner or later, perhaps even now, while I'm writing these lines, will you inevitably be called upon again to display wonders of similar heroism in overthrowing the power of the landowner and the capitalists, or waging an imperialist war. And obviously, as that time progressed and we come to October 1917, there were those conditions being worse, and the workers and the peasants realised under proper organisation the need to overthrow the provincial government and the system of capitalism itself. Now, a peaceful road to the revolution in dealing with countries with autocratic governments, Lenin was ruthless in pointing out necessity for an armed revolution. He said that in the period of imperialism, Marx's contention that peaceful revolution was possible in Great Britain and the United States was no longer valid. And now, I don't want this confused, as I said, about we all have to then have armed revolution. It depended on the material conditions of that time, of that particular historical epoch. That's why they had to do it that way. Obviously, when Marx described it peacefully, yes, well, capitalism was still developing in Britain and the United States, and no doubt around other places around the world as well. So at that time, there was no need to actually pick up arms and overthrow it. The working class was expanding, forming strong unions, and also the living standards was starting to rise. So it might have been a different way of going about it, but at that time, the Russian people themselves were in a very desperate situation. So I would make that loud and clear. And also, too, look, that's why we've got to be very careful not to divert from away from Marxism on this, either right opportunist or ultra leftism. I've heard the term, the quote, true political power is wieled through a barrel of a gun. I understand when that quote came out from Chairman Mao, it was under a particular historical conditions of that time. It's not to be blown out, and I like this also, the quote that came out. It's the gun does not control the party controls the gun, and that's what we want to understand as well. So for those who are wishing to pick up the gun and off they go, well, hang on, just stop right there. You're not going, and that's not going to way you're going to win people over either. In fact, you could maybe be very isolated and have the powers to be come down on you very, very harshly. So I'm not only just trying to wash that away, but we always understand that the reason why Lenin insisted on that armed revolution was the prevailing conditions of Russia at that time. So also, too, Lenin's policy gave the lie to those enemies who maintained them and still do. That communists advocate violence on principle. The Mensheviks and the SRs had control of the Congress of Soviets. The Communist Party, while advancing the slogan of no support for the provisional government, carried on a policy of peaceful agitational work. So remember that, peaceful agitational work. As Lenin said, the task was to present a patient, systematic and persistent explanation of the errors of their mistakes, their tactics and explanation, especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses. As long as we are in the minority, we carry on the work of criticising, exposing errors, and at the same time we preach the necessity of transferring the entire power of the state to the Soviets or workers and deputies. So that's where the patient work we have to do to explain it to the workers and their allies why we need to take power. And it certainly is a lot of patient, consistent work. There's going to be a lot of setbacks at times, but this is all about the best lessons learned are the painful ones at times, and we do need to learn how we move forward. Just advocating, we'll grab a gun and off we go. Yeah, it obviously will land in defeat. Now we'll continue on the Stockholm Zimmerwald Conference. Just have a look. That's the little last bit, 28. This was prior to it all. And meanwhile, in the ranks of world labour, the Russian Revolution of March had made a tremendous stir. It created profound enthusiasm, enormously stimulated the growing peace sentiment among the world's working masses. In Austria, late 1916, Friedrich Adler, son of the party leader Victor Adler, in order to arouse peace sentiment, had shot and killed the premier, Count Sturg. In Germany, there were hunger riots. Split took place in the Social Democratic Party and the Independent Social Democratic Party of centrist orientation. And what you're seeing here around the world, this was playing a huge role, especially in the European powers, and there were massive strikes. And come 1917, in Australia here, we had a big general strike in New South Wales amongst the railways and tramways. The whole railway and tram system just stopped completely. That was actually over to do with the Taylor system and time and motion of the work system. But however, also too, it was out of response to the war. There was also a massive anti-conscription movement by the time in Australia, and no doubt in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world. The IWW was still around at that time, played a very big role in that. There was certainly a lot of hostility. There was a lot less people volunteering going off to war. So the federal government, our national government, wanted to have conscription, which was voted down, and it went to a national referendum, and it was voted down again. People were sick and tired of it, and they were sick and tired of losing lives. I think sure as returned servicemen saw what the war was really about as well. So it was a marked contrast to 1914. Everyone marches off to war, hip hip hurrah for fatherland, motherland, whatever. And then 3 years later, it was by 1916 and 1917, there was mass strikes, splits in labour movements, et cetera, et cetera. So it showed you the role of the material conditions changing and the idea and the ideas and then the ideology changing at the time. So did you want add anything to that, Dust?
Great point. I just want to catch up with the comments. We just have a few. Shout out to Caleb Moppin. Thanks for tweeting this out. Anybody watching, if you want to share this on Facebook, share this out the Facebook groups, put this on the Twitter, make this a bigger conversation. MLUK, thanks for joining us. Ninkray, I believe, 2:30 in Venice. She's going to watch it later. So anybody who's watching this, if you want to tweet this out, share this out, make this bigger conversation, and feel free to ask questions or add in the discussion. Get active in the discussion. That's good. I liked your point about what should we have, a violent revolution or a peaceful revolution? And the answer is the material conditions determine that. Is there enough people ready or willing or wanting to have a revolution? And what makes people ready or willing or wanting to have a revolution? It is being desperate. It is their conditions. They can't take it anymore. They're forced to take a portion of their being and put it towards making the change. They can't continue to live as is. Yep. And you get masses of people who had put the time in to build the organizations necessary to have a violent revolution, then it's the right time to do it. But if you do it before then, the state's going to come down you and kill everyone, and you're going to alienate everyone from a revolution. So great point. It needs to be made over and over and over again. A lot of the ultras on, and isolated in bubbles, they just try to impress other revolutionaries and don't even actually try to talk to the people, the masses, who are the ones that are ultimately going to make revolution possible, is the masses of people. So we'll go right into 29. This is exciting. I am happy. I luckily got the odd numbers. The Russian Proletarian Revolution, November 1917. This is a world-changing earthquake of a moment. This is the first socialist revolution on a national-wide scale, not just any nation. Russia, one of the largest land-based country, as far as land mass, one of the largest countries in the world, and a socialist revolution. 1917, over 100 years ago, and it shook the world. Let me look back up. Okay, 29. Okay. So when the bourgeois came to power, they did two things wrong. They did not end the war, and they continued the repression of the peasantry. And this is where Lenin made his mean. This is how communists come to power. We can't unite with the bougie forces because what we want is justice for the people. They're not going to go along with it. It's going to hurt their material conditions. We have to get deeper and lower into the masses and find out the contradictions. What were the contradictions? The contradictions were the peasantry was being brutally oppressed. You had Marxists like Trotsky, who said you shouldn't even deal with from the left, you shouldn't even deal with the peasants, very anti-peasant, Trotsky. And then you had the bourgeois forces, when they took power, were repressive. So Lenin saw this contradiction, and he mobilized the peasantry behind the socialist revolution. And with the peasantry, they were able to take power in 1917. It was under the Bolshevik slogan, peace, land, and bread. It seems like right before an organization takes power, they have a very broad, massive appeal to the people. As they're getting big, they're getting bigger, and they're getting bigger. It's very revolutionary. But when they're right on the precipice of power, you have the largest appeal to as many masses of power you can get behind you to build the force necessary to take power. They even allowed Trotsky into the party at this point. So, I mean, this Trotsky, which is a menace later on, has been a menace, but he's on the workers. He proclaims to be for the revolution, so he's welcome into the party. So, when you need to work with as many forces as possible and to grow as much power as possible. This is the exact opposite of canceled culture, where everyone's trying to tear each other down, that's supposedly trying to accomplish the same thing. Lenin invited Trotsky into the party. Lenin reached out to the peasants and built the power necessary for a revolution with earthquake changing significance on the global political economic order. In this period, he wrote State and Revolution. While carrying out a revolution, he wrote a book about revolution. So a little bit about State and Revolution. It's a lot about how we cannot simply take over the bourgeois state. We have to smash it and rebuild it and form the dictatorship of the proletariat, which suppresses the bourgeoisie. So in Russia, they had the bourgeois revolution. Instead of Lenin trying to just take that over, he fought it and then changed it into a vessel that suppressed the bourgeoisie for the benefit of the working people and the peasants who helped lead that revolution. The conquest of power. So Lenin comes back from exile. He says the people are ready. Trotsky says, wait. Not yet. That's actually Trotsky is usually a left revisionist, and this specific he was right revisionist. He didn't correctly analyze that the people were ready to take power. He puts out calls for an uprising, and he mobilizes the peasants, he mobilizes the workers, and they took power. He united as many forces as possible, and then pushed to build up socialism. The Soviet government in action. They gave land. The peasants helped win the revolution. The peasants were immediately given land. They came through with their objectives. They came through with their promises. They took down the power of the landlords and the landowning estates and gave the land to the peasants. This is 1917. This is 7 years after. A lot of people don't realize it, but the 1910 Mexican Revolution had earth-shaking results, and where Emiliano Zapata in the South. This was 7 years before the Russian Revolution. This was a socialist. Technically, the Mexican Revolution was also, at least by name, a socialist revolution. And it was a peasant revolution. Emiliano Zapata gave mass land, returned the land to the people in Mexico. And to this day, in Mexico, there's still land plots available to small Mexican farmers. So I think this was largely possible. This was the zeitgeist at the time. This was the peasantry, tired of the poverty conditions being stolen. History was progressing. Lenin was able to tap into the contradictions of the peasantry and use that to come to power. And he gave them the land. He came through for the peasants. Let me get back. Okay. Interesting. Trotsky pushed for better peace terms while the Germans were continually invading. Trotsky's like, we need this and we need that. And Lenin's like, we need to get them out of here. We just took power. We're sign what we have to sign. Get the German invaders out. We need to build up this country and this force. We're gonna lose the gains we have if we continually have to fight with the Germans. So they were able to sign a peace treaty with the Germans and build up their power. They also were insistent on rights of oppressed nations, to self-determination. They were criticized um, by more left wing forces that didn't see that you can't just go in and take over a country. You have to, if you're going to work with people, you have to give them something for that working with you. So, right to self-determinations for oppressed nations. They're a part of helping them come to power. You want to stay in power, you have to be peaceful and respectful to your neighbors and have win-win cooperation to consolidate political power. Political power isn't a, Mao said it's not a tea party, but it's not a, this is my vision for the revolution. This is the perfect society. I will take power and I will implement this perfect society. No, the revolution and what happens because of that revolution has to be the demands of the coalition of the people that brought that revolution to power. And it has to do with the material conditions that exist at that time. Okay. I've lost my okay. I think I put that down here. There it is. Okay. The defense of the revolution. Immediately, the world capitalist response to the Bolshevik Party. The White Army and reaction, counter-revolutionary forces immediately attack them, along with invading army. Almost every capitalist country in the world invaded Russia because they were scared of the progress they were giving to their people and their workers. Great Britain, Japan, the United States, Poland, Romania, the Czechs invaded to try to put down the revolution, but they consolidated their power and they defended themselves against the invader and kept their power intact, so they continue to carry out the needs of the people. They, through great hardship, formed the Red Army and kicked out the invaders. There was strikes throughout Europe and the U.S. that were made in solidarity with the Soviets. So this was a very international thing. The Soviet Revolution inspired English workers and U.S. workers. Like, wow, the workers took power, and they went on strike, and they won strikes. This was an international phenomenon. The English actually had trouble sending troops. I think there was a leader that said we couldn't send as many troops as we could, or the troops would mutiny, and then we'd have Soviets in England if we were to send as many troops as the bourgeois wanted. Lenin took power. It's world-shaking power, world power for the workers. It's a changing moment. And there was U.S. troops that were sent that did mutiny. There was U.S. troops that said, why would we fight against a government that is supporting our cause back home? And they mutinied and they were sent back. Kautsky mobilized against him. Opportunist forces decried Lenin's defense. But it's interesting. So Kautsky and the opportunist force, when it came to Lenin's defending the revolution, Lenin implementing harsh revolutionary tactics. I think at one point, Caleb likes to say this a lot. At one point in the revolution, alcohol was banned with a death penalty. These are revolutionary times. We have no idea what people go through in revolutionary times. You're being invaded by all sides and all these armies. And your power could be taken away. These gains that you've made for the majority of people to improve their lives could be taken away at any moment. It takes harsh discipline, like the death penalty for drinking if necessary. So these so-called violence or injustices were decried and spoke up against by opportunists like Kautsky. So that Lenin's a horrible criminal. who kills people for drinking or needs military discipline and structure to maintain the revolution. But these opportunist forces were cheering on the mass slaughter in World War I, cheering on workers slaughtering each other because of their class position. It reminds me today, what I like to say, that the CIA funds this idea of like, it's almost as if these liberal forces connected with the Democrats and the bourgeoisie, maybe even CIA funded, they have an appeal to authority when it comes to the imperialists. They have an appeal to authority when it comes to the bourgeoisie and the massive amount of wars and genocides carried out by the United States. But they have this liberal, anarchist, utopian, this idea, this utopian anarchist standards applied to everyone else. Anyone who isn't an imperialist, when it comes to China and how they regulate their society. Oh, they're horrible and evil people. That can be pointed out. Or what happens in Venezuela can be pointed out as some injustice. When it comes to the United States, destroying Libya,
yes,
destroying the most prosperous nation in Africa, and having the slave trade return, they don't bat an eye. When it comes to the U.S. funding the Saudis, where there's mass famine and genocide in Yemen, they say nothing.
Exactly. And look Syria as well.
I'm done. Go ahead and get a response to Section 29.
Well, it's still a lot to cover there as well within that few pages, but it's widely important with revolution why there's had to be discipline. Obviously, if you just had revolution, you had to actually make a peace with the country you've been at war with for a few years. Look, just get it done, get at peace. And unfortunately, people like Trotsky at the time wanted to actually lambaste the Germans about the revolution and it's like, basically at the time, Russia was not in a position to take it on like that. They had to consolidate their power first and start rebuilding the country. And then when the war of intervention happened, obviously the Soviet Union at one stage was reduced to a size equivalent to our island state of Tasmania. Interesting enough. So it just shows you how very serious this kind of situation is. That could have been easily crushed if there wasn't any good iron-fisted leadership to it. I know it sounds brutal, but really in a lot of ways it's not. It's actually, you have to be in a command structure in such a way. You can't afford people consuming large amounts of alcohol and getting drunk, looting and plundering everything else. That's not revolution. Actually, that would have ended up in bloodshed and defeat, and it would have been a massive setback for the world working class at the time. So this is vitally important. How's it going to pan out in our countries? I can't tell at the moment, but it's vitally important why there sometimes has to be discipline and such. It's like with anything, there's always been discipline like that. You look at any overthrow of any system from, when the capitalists first came into power from feudalism, there was, in England, it was systematic iron fist rule. There was discipline about. They learnt their lessons and they had to, and crush any dissent against capitalism after that, maintain their power. So there's some lessons we need to learn from that. So it's I wouldn't be. It's not surprising people like Karl Kautsky at the time criticised it. Doesn't surprise me at all. But then it shows you how far removed he was from the working class and peasants as well. He's coming from an intellectual, petty bourgeois view on things, and obviously he would come out with something like that, but he wasn't the one leading the revolution, was he? So that's it's certainly what we always keep in mind. Some powerful lessons about learning that about revolutionary movements and why it had to be. I mean, we're not brutal. We're not, it doesn't have to be brutal in that, but there has to be a certain type of discipline if we're going to achieve something. Which now lets me into the next chapter, the Soviet system, number 30. It's on page 211 for those who've got the book. Now, what's widely important at the Soviet system, right? It was the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, smashing the bourgeois state and any of the feudal, any left of the Tsarist regime as well. Now, what's vitally important is what people understand. You don't just overthrow a system and don't replace it with something. You've got to actually start developing an economic basis. So you have an economic basis, the Soviet system, which will be determining the superstructure. which will then influence the economic basis again. But it's vitally important, and I'll just read these a little bit out here. It goes, the October Revolution, as distinct from all other revolutions since Stalin, overthrew all exploiters and transferred power to the most revolutionary class, the working people, the proletariat. Under its leadership, the old system of exploitation was destroyed and a new socialist system was established in which exploitation and oppression have no place. The Great October Socialist Revolution denotes a radical turn in the history of mankind, from the old capitalist world to the new socialist world. The new government, at first called the Russian Soviet Socialist Federated Republic, was later known the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, what was the core thing in that was the Soviets organised the workers and soldiers deputies. They formed the basis of the Soviet system, of the Soviet economic basis as well, how to manage it, run it, etc. Yes, there were capitalists still there in the country well after their overthrow, and obviously you saw through that counter-revolution they tried to fight back, but even after that they were still there. And obviously we go further through this book, we'll be talking about the 5-year economic plans, the NEPs, the first 5 years, so they were utilised, but the thing is, unlike they weren't utilised there to make profit for themselves and be back substitute for their own power anymore. No, wrong. They were utilised to help set things up, rebuild things for a new socialist economic order. And so it was. But I think there's that in confusion. It's like with China today, for example. It's a centralised planned economy and set it up in such a way. And yes, there's billionaires and millionaires there, but they're not in command. It's the people through their party, they're in command. And they're able to now to utilise all that to lift themselves out of poverty. So just that's how they had to actually start looking at things, forming up state farms, etc. There's a lot on the economic. I'll just going through some. So I'll talk about going through the economic basis. Because the Soviet Constitution establishes that all power in the USSR belongs to the working people of town and country as represented by the Soviets or working people's deputies. And also that the land, its mineral wealth, waters, forests, mills, factories, mines, rail, water and air transport, banks and communications, large state organised agricultural enterprises, state farms, machine and tractor stations and the like, as well as municipal enterprises and the bulk of dwelling houses in the cities and industrial localities are state property. That is, it belongs to the whole people. Exploitation, man by man, is specifically prohibited, and the work in the USSR is a duty and a matter of honour for every able-bodied citizen in accordance with the principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. The working motto in the Soviet Union is the socialist one of from each according to his ability to each according to his work. Socialism is the first stage of communism, of which the basic motto is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So what they'll basically do the large scale stuff, all the natural resources, forests, mines, etc., mineral wealth, and also large scale industries from your transport, obviously steel making, which they went into later on. All that was under public, was under the control of the working class through the Soviet system. And unlike what you see with a capitalist system, all that's under the control of the capitalists for private wealth, for the private profit motive. So that's the fundamental of things. Was there capitalist enterprises there still? Yes, there was. Let's face it. There, the corner shop was still around. But was that going to be nationalised? I don't think so. The small little farm or something was still around there as well. Yes, and you had small businesses and then medium-sized businesses still there. But they were actually harnessed for the Soviet. They were used, and now not for them to make for the private profit motive anymore. No, they're now directed to actually to manufacture or distribute whatever from behalf of the Soviet system. So that's something we've always got to be aware about. It's not like we just automatically when we have revolution we're going to nationalise the corner shop or the mum and dad farm. It doesn't work like that. And obviously, preferably we have them form in a cooperative. Like for example, a hotel, for example, there'd be no need for that to come under the control of the state, but that can be formed as a cooperative instead. These things are taking the plan, and what he's talking about is when I talk about the new economic policy, or the 5-year plans, are really important to have. And they had to utilise some of these. And I just want to some of the systems they have. I'll just want to read this. Since the seizure of power by the Workers' Soviet Society, highly flexible and progressive, was passed through three general stages. First was the period of war communism from 1918 to early 1921, the years of the civil and interventionist wars, with industry and agriculture collapsed and disintegrated, with the regime fighting for its life against a host of internal and external enemies. This was a time for the most rigid government controls of a universal ration system and the gravest hardships to the people. The second period of the new economic policy, beginning in 1921, was one which, to help stimulate production under the given conditions, an open market was established for the peasants, and certain small manufacturing and private trading was allowed. And foreign trade and the commanding heights of industry, however, remained in the hands of the government. That's the third period, culminating in the complete victory of socialism, with the vast bulk of all production carried on by state industry and collective farming got well underway about 1927 and was continued with growing strength until the present time. Now the USSR is at the verge of beginning to introduce a higher stage of classless society and communism. Now, keeping in mind, as I said here, Russia, or the Soviet system, only just recently came into being. It had a revolution, it had to deal with a counter-revolution. Its industries, land that was degraded, everything was smashed. They had to build from the start. So hence why they utilised some of the capitalists there to help build their system. So straight away, you're not going to get rid of every complete capitalist modes of production, but instead of them, the capitalists being used for their own private profit motive, no, they were then harnessed to use to rebuild the industry, and at that time, and they had to. Obviously, you had people starving. You got to feed the people. You make sure they've got water, they've got air, they've got shelter and clothing, and even health and education. So some vital needs they had to do at the time. I believe some of that divergences from Marxism, like the ultra left, enunciated, saying, "Oh, that was state capitalist." Wrong. It's definitely wrong. No, it was not state capitalist. If anything, well, then, if you call that state capitalist, well, we might as well call Saudi Arabia socialist. Wrong. That's if again, the government in Saudi Arabia owns everything, but it's there to benefit the Saudi royal family, etc. So that's but what the Soviets were doing was benefiting the working class and the peasants, and their need to urgent actions they had to do to now then start stabilising the country, rebuilding it again. So these were the early foundations. The political structure, obviously, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, or rule of the workers. It means that the leading class in the Soviet government is the working class. In the beginning, this proletarian class leadership was expressly stated in the Constitution, adopted on the 1st of July 1918. Allowing the workers one representative in the National Congress of Soviets for each 25,000 persons, and the peasants only one for each 125,000. But in 1936, the 1936 Constitution, this unequal ratio was eliminated. At the present time, the USSR made up of three friendly classes: workers, peasants, and intelligentsia, with harmonious economic and political interests, is well on the way towards a classless society. But they were establishing that, and that political structure came out of the economic basis, and they had to set that up. Now, the reason why the working class had to be the majority there, well, they're the ones in power, so they needed to make sure that they keep that. The peasantry to a certain degree. There was a lot of peasants out there, but also too, you had a lot of wealthy peasants, etc. You had a lot of infiltrators in that movement, so they needed to make sure that the working class was the leading role of that right through, with the help of the party. And obviously, democracy in the Soviet Union is on an altogether high level, and in any capitalist country has been so since the Great Revolution. This fact is demonstrated by the basic democratic realities in the ownership of all industry and national resources by the people, and full political equality existing among the many nationalities making up the Soviet state. The complete equality of women with man in every sphere of life, the punishment of anti-Semitism and other racial and national chauvinism is a crime. Universalisation of higher education, the establishment of such basic freedoms as the right to work and the right to leisure, the direct participation of the mass organisations of the people, trade unions, cooperatives and others, in the government of the country, and the generally high level of the civil rights of the people. The Constitution 1936 being far and away the most democratic in the world. The foundations of this whole government structure are the thousands of local Soviets organisations which combine the executive, legislative and judicial branches of government in a single organisation under the direct control of the people. Now, wouldn't that be amazing if we had that here in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, Britain, Western European powers. Man, what we'd be having a different discussion now. But you look at the systems we live under. No, we do not have a say in the running of it at all. Yeah, we might go to on election day, go and elect someone to sit their bums into Parliament. But the fact is, we do not have a say at all in the running of our system. All decisions, all bits of legislation are there to maintain the private profit motive, to protect profit and keep it going. That's why when I actually deal with work, when I actually have meetings with workers and they say, oh, what can't we got rights? Well, this is supposed to be democratic. Wrong again. Every law on that is geared against us to protect profit. That's the fundamental difference. Under the socialist system, every law and rights are there for given for the right of the working class and the peasants, no doubt, and it benefit them. Under capitalism, we don't have freedom from unemployment. We don't have freedom from poverty. We don't have freedom from destitution or anything. Well, it's interesting how libertarians go about, personal liberty. Well, okay, no worker has got the liberty to just go on strike when they like without repercussions. No worker has liberty from unemployment. No worker has liberty from losing their house, or liberty from the banks or the plaintiffs coming around knocking on to kick them out of the house. No, they don't have that. The capitalists have liberty, but not as the working class. We're indifferent. The socialist system, you're free from all that, and it's guaranteed. And you have a say. You actually are physically participating in the running of the system itself. You do have a say at all levels, from where you're working, at the workplace, even outside of work. At all levels of the Soviet system, you have an opportunity to participate and be involved in the democratic decision making of it. It's quite a complex place. And that's actually term you could sort of look at when you hear about when communist parties talk about democratic centralism. Well, you can see that now on a large scale for our country. So that's what you're seeing there. So it's always vitally important. The economic foundation, well, it's a little bit more on that. I won't go through that, but we're talking about the first 5-year plans, etc. And obviously, during the time of the second 5-year plan, they had to start moving forward, getting things produced and electrified. Heavy engineering played a role. It's vitally important to understand, because Russia prior to the revolution, and just after, was still quite incredibly backward for industry. They had very little or none at all. They had to have a lot of work to do. And even come 1931, because of the rise of fascism, which we'll talk about further as we go through this book, they saw a serious threat. So they really went for well. It was one of the most within a short span of time, not even a blink of a human eye. In the history of time, there have been such large-scale expansions of industry. The trade unions in the Soviet system, and I just want to emphasise something on trade unions. Now, there was some talk by some comrades one time, well, under socialism, workers won't need trade unions. Wrong. The fact is, at the end of the day, trade unions played a positive role in the Soviet system as well. But what happens, trade unions, as we know it under a capitalist system, to mainly primarily deal with wages conditions, were actually devolved into a higher level of organisation, how to help workers run factories, how to run mines, how to run their transport industry, etc., etc., etc. They actually played a very big role in helping workers, guiding them through development of industry. It's interesting. I actually got the opportunity to meet someone from that who lived in Soviet Union, I think, in the early 80s, and even by then, he said the role of trade unions, and it's just totally different from what we knew about them in the West here. And on forward, I just want to read this first paragraph. Trade unions in a socialist country obviously must play a very different role than they do in a capitalist country. It's like I stated there. Their function is determined by the fact that workers control the government and there are no capitalist exploiters to fight. This gives workers, who are the leading class in the dictatorship of the proletariat, a direct sense of responsibility for the conditions in industry and for the success of the regime in general. I wouldn't call them a regime, but anyway, something they cannot have in profit-ridden capitalist countries. Like all other Soviet institutions, trade unions today are the result of much experimentation and pioneering work. In the beginning, with no clear ideas prevailing as to just how the trade unions were to operate under socialism, there was division between the shop committees and the national unions, many believing the latter institutions to be superfluous. But soon the unions came to be based upon the shop committees as their foundation units in industry. And so they turned to take on the functions of how we can operate the economy on a large scale as well. But it was, instead of being top down, it was bottom up from the shop committees. And yeah, so that's very important. So if you've ever heard, when you've heard this very radical ultra leftist thing, oh, workers don't need unions under socialism, wrong. Wrong again. They actually play a vital role, but it's a different form of organisation struggle than what we know it in a capitalist country. Dust, do you want to add on anything to that?
This period's amazing. Like this hasn't been done before. So just think about it. So even if, there was obviously problems, but even if it was to fail, this had never been done. This is attempting to form a new existing society that benefits and helps people. It's never been done before. And if they would have tried it and they would have failed, it would have been an accomplishment that we could have learned off of. But they tried it and they succeeded, and they succeeded greatly. Like this is amazing. It's I guess I'll go right into 31. Let's see. Right. 31, page 217. Ooh. The German and Hungarian revolutions, 1918 to 1919. So empires and feudal systems were transformed because of World War I, because of the instability of the system. World War I and the instability basically was the downfall of these empires and feudal, mixed between feudal capitalist systems. And the modern nations that we know today were really formed. And the modern nations that formed were ruled by social democrats, forces that claimed to be socialist. There was a lot of opportunism in this. And the social democrat opportunists suppressed Lenin proletarian elements that were pushing for the two-stage revolution. First the bourgeois revolution, and then the workers' revolution. The social democrats were used by the capitalists and the bourgeoisie to either to suppress Leninists and people that supported the Soviet Revolution. They were used to suppress those elements. Soviets in Germany, left forces like Rosa Luxemburg, and there was also right forces. They had almost a bloodless coup. The soldiers mutinied in World War I. This reminds me of the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, with the anti-war cafes, who said, there was David Rovics, my last guest, wrote a folk song, and he's on 1968, and he says he pulled the pin through the grenade. Praise be to Ho Chi Minh. The German workers knew they were fighting they were fighting their class allies. German workers sent to kill a workers' government. And this was recognized in the 60s. There was socialists here that understood that they were fighting socialists in Vietnam. The revolution betrayed. Social democrat liberal leaders worked with factory owners to smash Soviet allied forces. They were able to get some concessions like 8-hour day, a union, but they had the ability to take socialism like they did in the Soviet Union, but they didn't do it because the power of the bourgeois was so big, and power was so infiltrated into the social democrats. They were able to suppress these elements. It's arguably that the bourgeoisie wasn't as powerful of a political force in Russia at the time. It was a bigger political force in Germany, and after they overthrew the feudalists, the bourgeois was able to hold on to power and suppress working class revolutionary elements. They also used the labor aristocracy, which usually refers to imperialism, a higher paid group of workers that support the empire, which is true in this case, but it's mostly they were able to recruit the trade unionists, the people with specific tasks that were paid a little bit more instead of the industrial workers. They were usually used the trade workers against the industrial workers, against the interests of the lower paid workers. Leftists were killed, suppressed. There was actually an interesting, the Bavarian Republic was short-lived. It was eventually, the workers took power. There was actually a form of workers that took power, the Bavarian Republic, but it was eventually smashed by these opportunist forces. They made several mistakes. The bourgeois resumes full charge. Capitalists put the Social Democrats at the head, knowing they would do nothing for the workers because of their opportunist petty bourgeois position. Another interesting thing that happened this period was the Versailles Treaty, and this had lasting implication. The Versailles Treaty basically put the German workers into poverty for years to come, and led to the conditions that led to the rise of fascism, led to the rise of Hitler. The opportunists again would use revolutionary phrases, conservative deeds. The Hungarian Revolution. There was an Austro-Hungarian Empire split into the Austrian bourgeois republic. The Hungarian had a socialist revolution, but through harsh attacks from the outside, and this is interesting. The Hungarian socialists refused to give land to the peasantry, and they were ultimately defeated. They also accepted the Social Democrats into their party, which was another mistake they made, led to their downfall. Anything to add on this section?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, what was looking at, this was the end of the one area, and that was actually massive strike waves going right back. You had revolt by the sailors in 1916. I think it was the German Navy revolting against the Tsar. So Germany was up in a lot of upheaval at the time, and there was some good role. It was both economically and what was happening around. People were very similar conditions. For those workers in Russia, they were starving. Some were actually going hungry and all that. So you can see what was happening here. The material conditions were so bad that the working class and the peasants had to do something. Just so actually on that note, if you actually have a look at I think the current Austrian flag, it's got the black eagle on it, two-headed eagle. But you look at their claws. They're holding one's claws holding a hammer, another one a sickle. And that was actually that came from during that time of that revolution. And also too, if anyone is interested in visiting Austria, I would recommend actually visit the Karl Marx Hof and the Friedrich Engels Hof. It's massive buildings they built. One of the communists built that, I think, in the 1920s. It's there basically for housing for working class people. It was also a place of resistance against the Nazis when they entered Austria in the 1930s at that time. But so you can see the remnants of that history there as well. So it's certainly quite rich. But only the Hungarian one, there were, as I said, those mistakes were made. Hindsight's beautiful. Hindsight's beautiful. We can look back and see, they should have given land to peasant regions. They shouldn't have allowed the Social Democrats to do that. Rosa Luxemburg and company should have done this and that, everything else. But instead of actually looking at that way, yes, no, they should have. But at that time, things take off pretty damn quickly. And like the Paris Commune, when it just took off, And it's at the time there were certain decisions no one's been able to do this before. So really, by then they didn't have as much experience. They've had a lot of practice in theory and some and also practical stuff, but you don't not compared to what this. So what the vital lessons we need to learn is this: where revolutionary in our countries is the role of the other forces we must be aware of as well. Who are our allies? Who are our opponents? And obviously, do not give your opponents any leeway either, because they will come back and smash you, just like what they've seen in Austria, Hungary, Germany, etc. So that's it. So we'll go on to number 32, formation of Third International. Now, before I do, we were just talking before this video, before we started, I want to read a poem. There's a book of poetry called Harvest Time from another poem from, I don't know if you can see it, by Vic Williams. He was an elderly comrade, passed away back in 2010 in his 90s. He was a member of the Communist Party, joined up in the 1930s, actually, just prior to the war, I think it was. But he came from poor background, from poor rural background. His father lost his property for the Depression. I think Vic was involved in a lot of the unemployment marches in Western Australia at the time. I got to meet him in 2005, and obviously he was a really good, excellent teacher. I think over the time, so I was always wondering why he was like a particular way, but I'll get that through practical experience. But he is a writer and a poet, along with his wife Joan Williams, who was a journalist as well, both communists. He was really knew his philosophical stuff. And I want to read this poem to Are You Ready, Monty Miller? Now, just for, especially with Australian comrades, but about those who are interested around the world. Monty Miller was born in the 1830s here when there were still penal colonies in Tasmania, well, then known as Van Diemen's Land. And he was sold off or apprenticed off in Sydney as an apprentice carpenter when he was a young boy. Back then, the apprenticeship scheme wasn't a matter if you had a job interview with an employer and you in a trade, you were sold off in some form of master-servant relationship. So the master carpenter owned you, basically. You became part of his family. But it was pretty brutal back then. He did try to, basically made a simple mistake one day and he was flogged by his master with a knotted rope with bits of glass in it, with a brutal beating. So now he had to make an escape. Now, if apprentices used to escape from their masters, they used to be rounded up by the early police, which one of the first things our early police used to do is round up runaway apprentices and bring them back for another brutal thrashing by their masters. So he ran away on the road to the colony of Victoria at the time. And he first became a shepherd, worked on someone's property, and then went off to the goldfields around Ballarat at the time, part of the central Victorian goldfields. And obviously, at the time, in a very historical epoch of our history is the Goldfields Rebellions, which started in 1851 near Castlemaine with a big monster meeting. We had Red Britain Rebellion here in Bendigo in 1853, which culminated in bloodshed at the Eureka Stockade in 1854. And from then, after that, he was politically active, especially in the Labor movement, early Labor movement, the formation of the first social democratic forums, etc., right through. And even through World War I, he joined the Wobblies. So by the time he was in his 70s and 80s, he was in the Wobblies, agitating on the goldfields in Victoria, moved to Western Australia, very active in the goldfields there around Kalgoorlie and even to Fremantle, the port near Perth. And he passed away in 1920, just the formation of the Communist Party of Australia at the age of 85. He was a legend, and he actually was arrested in 1917 for sedition and then sentenced to 6 months hard labour. So, and he was an internationalist as well. So he actually gave the thumbs up to the whole Communist International and the formation of the party. But I want to read this poem that goes, Are you ready, Monty Miller? Are you ready, Monty Miller? For the lords beyond the sea have ruled all the diggers must pay the licence fee. They would make us conscript labour, take from us the rights we won, but the diggers are defiant, and now the redcoats come. I was ready, fellow diggers, face the guns at Bakery Hill and the sabres of the soldier as they came to clash, slash and kill. But though their guns are silent and their whips are hidden now, their creed of force was written in the scar across my brow. Are you ready, Monty Miller? louder than the Kaiser's guns. The generals shout for power to make conscripts of our sons. They'd smash the referendum, black out the warning lamp. For their victory and their profit, they have marched our sons to camp. I was ready, fellow workers, when the robber war began. We called for strikes to block them, but they jailed us, every man. They condemned us for sedition, but still our numbers grow. It was Labor's road to freedom, and when the people shouted no. Are you ready, Monty Miller? For they tread the waves of war. Their bombers circle Darwin. Their marines have stormed ashore. Our lands, our youth, our hostage to their rising nuclear tide. For our lives, our independence, we need you by our side. I'll give you the youth my courage. I bequeath the old my cause, but it needs the many millions to put down the many wars. When you need a new Eureka and my voice to crush their lies, Monty Miller will be with you when you march and organise. And as said, Monty Miller fought and was wounded at Eureka. He opposed World War I from the beginning, was a foremost campaign against conscription, and for that in 1917 was jailed and sentenced to 6 months hard labour when he was 85. He was an internationalist. So there you go. So there's poetry there. So historical figure in our time, and he was actually one of our revolutionaries we did have for Australia. So yes, all the Australian comrades there, we do have our revolutionaries as well. Okay, number 32, formation of the Third International, 1919. So obviously this was a very important development in the international communist movement, the formation of the Third International, which became the Communist International, or the Comintern, as to be later known. Because when the Third Communist International was formed in March 1919 in Moscow, the capitalist world was in a state of exhaustion and disarray. World War I and the Russian Revolution had dealt the system terrific blows, for which it was and still is unable to recover. These great events marked the beginning of the general crisis of capitalism, the period of its decline and decay, the epoch of imperialist world wars and proletarian revolutions. It came when the communist. When it came into being a communist international, as it was the capitalist system was in disarray big time. Most of the working class, or pretty much all of the working classes around the world, had enough of war. They had enough of destitution. They've had enough of poverty. Even interesting, a lot of the returned soldiers coming back from World War I were anti-war. A lot of them actually joined the respective communist parties around the world. And even a little story about that for Western Australia. There was during the 1919, during the May Day marches, celebrations, and that they had it on May the 4th of that time of that year. There was a massive big strike on the waterfront. The employers wanted to bring in scab labour, work the wharves. So obviously there was a revolt by the workers, and actually all the Fremantle, if you had a bird's eye view, at that time when there was a dispute, all the Fremantle from everywhere, there'd be reverends and priests and churches telling their delegations, to the wharves, and they all supported the workers in that struggle. If you had a bird's eye view, you would have seen thousands of people just diverge on the wall and the walls to have a big, and there was a massive battle with the police. Horseshoes with where even women grabbed horseshoes and just threw them at the police and all that. Police had to make a retreat, but unfortunately, one worker, Norman Brown, don't quote me on that name, was shot, and unfortunately, it was a fatal. He later died in hospital. And on that, he actually had one of the biggest funeral processions ever in the state of Western Australia, bigger than any. The only other one that would have been Prime Minister John Curtin, wartime Prime Minister. So that's certainly it is. But at the time, there was a returning ship full of soldiers from World War I, and they were all armed. And news got to them about this dispute. They wanted to disembark and help the workers. That's our thing. They had enough. They were prepared to take up arms against the state and help the workers. So that in itself alone, no one had to tell them that. They came to their own conclusion. And another funny story of that time as well, there was a returned soldier. He was a captain, Captain Hugo Throssell. He earned a Victoria Cross, I think twice, in World War I, which is equivalent to your Purple Heart in the US, one of the highest military order or honour. Anyway, he was at a large public gathering. The then Premier of Western Australia was greeting them all, welcome home, and respectively is quite a conservative, pompous affair. You should have seen the look on the Premier's face and a lot of conservative people when he turned around and says, yes, I might have obtained this Victoria Cross. I fought in wars. That's why I'm a card-carrying socialist now. Imagine that. High-ranking captain. Oh, that's so that was obviously, but it showed you at that time a capitalist system. Even might be even situations like that. The bourgeoisie were worried. They were completely scared. They didn't know what to do at times. And this forming the Communist International, or the Third International, was, as it was called then, it was major. It made a major influence and everything, and it certainly had the world bourgeoisie running very scared. Basically, they had their bums kicked for the first time in a long time in history, and it just kept going. Now to be, and the importance, and I'll talk about the importance of why they had to be formed. But it was really important, and it really had the bourgeoisie, and if we can do that again, look, it'd be great if we can do that again, and I think we would have the bourgeoisie scared around the world. I think they are scared. That's why they spend so much time putting so much anti-communist, anti-Marxist material out. It just shows you how scared they are. So the resurrection of the, it also explained too at the time the resurrection of the Second International. Obviously by then, that was it was a foul, decaying corpse, is what Lenin would describe at the time. And around that, those who are still involved with the Second International, like the German Social Democrats, the German Kautskyans were especially all active in whitewashing the right wingers of their war guilt, and also the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. They obviously, by the time they reformed, they weren't as strong as what they would have been on the outset when they first formed in the late 1800s. But they were certainly, when they came together, when we read through it, the resurrection, the Second International, just how corrupt, how totally devoid of any actual proper working class consciousness these people had. Interesting, when they reformed it again, the German Social Democrats weren't as welcome into it by the social democratic parties of the other Western countries, such as Britain, etc., and France. There was still quite deal of hostilities because their allegiance to their respective bourgeoisies of their country. Goes under the general head of the pulling the forces of capitalism together again after the Great Wars of War I, the Russian Revolution. The corpse of the Second International was disinterred and galvanised into life at the General Socialist Conference held in Bern in February 1919. Actually, they should have called it the Non-Socialist Conference of Bern. In its post-war role, the Second International was to even be more blatantly than ever a pro-capitalist organisation, setting for itself the ultra-reactionary task in close cooperation with employers of beating back the advancing proletarian revolution. So even the international bourgeoisie saw the importance of reforming this again. If they can try and crush the workers in other ways as well, by buying them off, by finding other ways to stop them advancing, they'd certainly do it. And that's what they'd still do today. They'll find all sorts of avenues to try and beat back workers. Also, moving on as well, and obviously to the term that you term socialist, as I said, there's a lot of parties that call themselves socialist, and they're not. They're social democratic. It's interesting how parties give themselves some fancy names. Like I'll give you a classic example here. I mean, the Liberal Party. It's not a free libertarian party at all. It's actually a conservative party. And Lenin actually did a little read on Australia in 1913. I think it's just called On Australia, and he described the Labor Party as a bourgeois party, as the liberal bourgeois party, and the liberals as conservatives. You could just it's on the Marxist Internet archive, but that was a little snippet on Australia. And yeah, it's interesting where there was a Labor Party prior to War One, I think early part of the 20th century in government, but controlled both houses of government, but never threatened the capitalist state at all. So it's in a strange little country that happened. So yeah, parties give themselves all names. You've got a Labor Party. I might think it'd be workers, but it's not. It's a liberal bourgeois party, and like our Liberal Party, yeah, it's a conservative party. So there you go. A call for the Third International on January 24th, 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference was the meeting, and just prior to the holding of the Bern Socialist Conference, the representatives of 8 Marxist parties at a meeting in Moscow, including the parties of Russia, Poland, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Latvia, Finland, and the Balkan Revolutionary Socialist Federation, plus one unofficial delegate, Rhinestone, of the American Socialist Labour Party, sent out a call in the name of the Russian Communist Party for a World Congress to establish a third or Communist International. invitation was sent to 39 left parties, labour unions and other groups throughout the world. And obviously the Congress call amounting to a basic program principles and action and drawn up in agreement with the program of the Spartacus Union in Germany and the Communist Party Bolshevik in Russia, and containing 15 points. These called for the revolutionary seizure of power, the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, disarming of the bourgeoisie and the arming of the proletariat, the suppression of private property in the means of production and their transfer to the proletarian state, the Marxist characterization of the role of the right-wing and centrist groups, and the establishment of a new world organisation to be called the Communist International. And for the first time in a long time, this was actually then to actually start to help and establish communist parties around the world to establish the proletariat or working class on an international scale. And obviously that was from the lessons learned of the previous international, the second international, and even the first international, I dare say, as well. And it actually carried on that spirit of the first international, of the International Working Men's Association, about workers of all countries unite, and that was the importance of why we had to be organised on an international level. The Congress on the 2nd to the 6th of March 1919, 19 parties and groups were represented, several other delegates being arrested on the way by hostile governments. Gee, I wonder why they were arrested. The published lists of the delegations and their voting strength as followed: America, CP, 1, Austria. Well, I actually won't read out because it would take up a lot of time. But obviously you had observations from other countries as well. Australia at the time wasn't. Well, obviously that was just prior to a year prior to forming the Communist Party of Australia. And yeah, so at the time some countries there were observations but needed to do some work as well. So if, but it was, and as Lenin pointed out also, comrades, our meeting has a great world historical importance. It shows the collapse of all illusions of bourgeois democracy, but not only in Russia, but even the more developed capitalist countries of Europe, as, for example, Germany's civil war has become a fact. So it actually showed the correctness of Marxism, Leninism, the science of socialism, scientific socialism, the correctness of it. It showed that, and as I said, it had the world bourgeoisie scared big time. So they obviously, you know, for that we'll be reading through all the reactions of the world bourgeoisie as we continue on, and obviously with the program of the congresses that we need to look at, and I'm just going to see how, because quite a lot of it. Yeah, but most importantly, well, two things: when it was for the formation of it, and then obviously the formation of there was also the Young Communist International as well, the YCL, very important later on in that year. So, which was obviously 29 delegates took place in Berlin under illegal conditions as well, with 14 countries represented. So it's vitally important to involve the youth, and they formed their organisation, the Young Communist League, or the Young Communist International. And that's also probably important about the youth wing. I think Lenin actually explained the vital importance of youth involved in these movements, or in the actions. And also, yeah, the important role the youth do play everywhere. And obviously it has been proven correct again. Then obviously the program of the Second International, correct program of the Second Congress. Sorry. I think obviously this was developed around about from the prevailing chaos amongst the capitalist countries after the war. And obviously we needed a strong program for the communist movement to move forward. Obviously it was international, and it had a lot of issues it needed to fight under the prevailing conditions thrown at it. And obviously from there too, it was important something, because I want to talk about left-wing communism, but when you're looking at programs, it comes through some fierce debate at times amongst comrades, and some very intense discussions. But the most important thing is developing a role for the communist movement. I just want to read this, but where he says, estimating the situation as a whole, he said, the bourgeois system all over the world was experiencing a great revolutionary crisis, and the revolutionary parties must now prove by their practical deeds that they have sufficiently intelligent and organised to have suffered contacts with the exploited masses, are sufficiently determined and skillful to utilise this crisis for a successful and victorious revolution. Lenin was then addressing himself principally, of course, to the workers of Europe, but had Germany and a few other countries in Central Europe overthrown capitalism, this undoubtedly would have created a revolutionary situation on a world basis. So just saw that from the previous chapter, you could see with the mistakes that were made in Hungary and Germany. If they did not make those mistakes, you would have just seen it would have been an interesting discussion then when they formed this international. So out of that, that's why it was vitally important to form this, to learn from those lessons, but also to develop proper programs for the various communist parties around the world prevailing under the conditions of their countries at the time. Which actually, I just want to talk, because it moves on to about left-wing communism that came out. A very important document. There's actually more of a rallying against ultra-leftism. Now, along with him, Lenin's great work, Imperialism, the higher stage of capitalism, Lenin's work, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, I highly recommend all comrades to thoroughly read it, because the amount of times I've heard a lot of deviations from Marxism, especially ultra-leftism. And I'll go back to what the unions, and I've noticed when I'm watching presentations that people's commentations, oh, they're Labour aristocracy, oh, unions are sellouts, and all this sort of things. And while those things possibly happen, yes, and then probably things do happen. And I'm not saying they're all perfect organisations, but what's our role? And the question, what Lenin put to it, no, we don't go start setting up our own pure type of organisations, because the working class, we've got to go where the working class is. Unions are a classic example there, where you find a cluster of workers, concentration of them. They might be, their leadership might be conservative, but what we don't need to do is be involved in that and talk to those workers. And some of the most reactionary organisations will, but we got to talk to them, not trying to make up our own organisations, the pure form. This is it. They're wrong. Everything else. You're not going to attract the workers, and that's what he was fighting against that. And that's what some of the what we call the left communists made those mistakes, because what they were doing is isolating themselves from the masses. And as Caleb said, we need to get out of the movement and into the masses. And this is what we've seen today with a lot of groupings around the world. I won't mention names, all those groups are, but understand they're so isolated from the masses of the working class and its allies. And they come across all this sort of great theory, all these little theories on how things should work, and one of the reasons why they're wrong is because this is what's happened. So basically, there's a catch cry. Left-wing communism is get out of the movement, get back into the masses, and where you find the masses of workers as well, in your neighbourhoods, your workplace, unions, wherever else, and help them organise from there as well. And also, too, you battle against a lot of the no-compromise positions of Trotsky and Bukharin and that, and example, and also too taking ultra-leftist actions a whole lot, which could actually lead the revolutionary movement into a massive lot of trouble as well. It can actually lead to defeat. And I'll give you that close example with the signing the treaty with the German Empire at the time. Trotsky went in there with ultra-leftist phrase-mongering at German generals. I mean, as I said, Russia was not in a position to take on Germany in a revolutionary manner. No, but you're there just to sign a peace treaty. That's it. Okay, we'll agree to that. And that will outweigh, and we'll worry about that later on. But no, he wanted to go in there, and this is what, and actually, we ended up actually making things worse. The other one was ultra-leftist thing. We should actually, Trotsky wanted to actually mobilise the Russian army to go marching to Germany and help to develop a revolution there. What a bad mistake would that be? First of all, you had to go through a newly formed Poland, so the Poland wouldn't have accepted that. And then secondly, it would have actually led to major defeat. So hence why it's vitally important, his book Left-Wing Communism. And so I recommend it's a highly good read. We may even do a live study of that in future date. But before comrades, have a read of it and see what, and make your own minds up, obviously. But it's vitally important, both all the deviations. So second international, we talked about a lot of the right opportunism, but also too, we had to look at the ultra-leftism tendency as well. We then need to look at, and vitally important because you can actually go a step too far ahead and you can be totally isolated from the masses. And I'll give you, and even like just what we previously discussed about insurrection, revolution, and now we've got to be vitally important, especially here in Australia. If we all of a sudden grab guns and run down the street with them, guess what's going to happen? You have the powers that be, the fully armed police come out and shoot us all, and we would have no support anyway from the working class either. So that certainly is. Certainly.
Are you still on 32? Are you still on section 32?
Yeah. So I want to. Oh, I think I
So
jumped. I do apologise, comrades. I jumped for. I flipped by a couple of pages and thought, oh, left-wing communism. So sorry to steal your thunder.
Yeah.
Hey. We'll have one mistake.
I mean, I'll just respond to 32 quickly, and I'll try not to go too far over what.
I do apologise, comrades, and everyone.
It's fine. Let's see. So this is it. This is what we're talking about. We're forming the Third International. The Lenin and the Bolsheviks have taken power, and now we're forming international organizations to coordinate the world zeitgeist of workers coming up around the world and overthrowing feudalist systems and keeping their conditions and fighting against their employees to put this together. I just wanted to reach a few of the comments. There was a discussion about the UN, which was interesting in the comments. And it's interesting that the man above my head, Che Guevara, made appeals to the UN for Cuba's behalf. So, I mean, it is an imperialist organization, but revolutionaries had made appeals to the UN. And one of my most respected comrades in the U.S., Jamu Baraka, has been pushing the idea of instead of civil rights, human rights, which is international. Go to the international courts, UN, and shout out to Space Communists. And I'm about to go over 33. I think there was a question. Oh, there was a question in the comments about unity between leftists and Europe from a Kim. It passed by. And you got to look at this in a material. Well, first of all, Marx never said leftists of the world unite. He said workers of the world unite. So if you want to build and support revolution, you need to go. You should go to the people that if another leftist is saying the right line and building, you can go to them. But most of all, you need to get in your neighborhood, in the workplace, go to the worker beside you and get workers into socialism. And the various organizations that exist in imperialist countries are representations of different classes, petty bourgeois, folks within the union movement, or stagnated forces. We need to be innovative and get out of the movement to the masses.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll go to read my notes.
Comrades, I jumped a bit ahead there. So we're back to.
Right, I'm going to read my notes anyways. He probably already went over this. Second perspective, Second Congress. Masses all over the world were inspired by the Russian Revolution. Woodrow Wilson, the racist. Woodrow Wilson actually had a showing of the film Birth of a Nation that praised the KKK. People think that Woodrow Wilson was a great president. Well, they need to read Prejudicial by Margaret Kimberly. Woodrow Wilson showed a film praising the KKK in the White House. So no, it doesn't. So it makes sense that he would be fearful of the revolutions. Opportunists alike rushed. So there was also revolutionaries and opportunists wanting to join the Comintern, because this was a global movement throughout the world. Workers were inspired. They were ready. They were excited. They wanted to do it. So they had a problem with opportunists and revolutions. You mentioned the Communist League. Won't go into that. Program of the Second Congress. Lenin gave the speech. Back to the point. And actually, the question that Akim did about the unity between leftist parties goes to where Lenin's speak was work with the masses. Was Lenin's speak which means we want rights for the workers. We want material improvement for the workers. So we go to the workers and we mobilize those forces in their interests. Yep. Build power. The contradictions is what gives us the ability to build power to change those contradictions. This is scientific socialism. This is the magic. This is power. This is scientific power and understanding to be able to go to the forces in society, analyze it, work with those forces, and bring about change in our society. As you said, left-wing communism, phrase-mongering, trying to appear left, not wanting to get the work done, not wanting to file the papers. IWW, not wanting to participate in larger unions, which I really liked your personal story on that. The IWW was wanting to form, and other left groups wanted to form smaller breakaway unions and isolate themselves instead of reaching out to the larger unions where the people are at. Go to the masses.
Yeah.
The 21 points. 21 points was basically because of all these opportunist organizations were trying to join the Comintern because that's where the workers were, and they wanted to bring that political power to their camp. He had to put standards out, make standards for joining. Strong, disciplined organizations with strong principles and democratic centralism. Mm-hmm. Democratic centralism is one of the most effective, efficient, and most democratic ways of running an organization. You take input from the workers. You understand the conditions of the workers. You talk to the workers. You talk to the press forces, your representative, and you run it in a concrete, stable, no-nonsense, hierarchical structure that can get things done. Democratic centralism. And a lot of the liberals and bourgeoisie didn't like that. So, I mean, there was a lot of splits within parties. Also, Lenin said, you have to be against your own country's imperialism. You have to be against your own country's imperialism. And I think some of the comrades in Europe still don't see this. They still don't recognize their governments. Even though they're not the U.S. The U.S. is the leader of the imperialist camp. The European governments are a part of the imperialist bloc, benefit from imperialism. There's a tendency amongst European leftists to not point out their government's role in imperialism, which Lenin had a problem with all the way back in the beginnings of the Third Revolution. The Third International. So there was splits within parties. Parties were kicked out. There's also the publication of the Communist International. All right. Any response to Section 33?
Well, yeah. I think it's not important. As I said, once again, I'll steal your thunder. And just for Leo there with his commentary, I'm in Australia. I think we'll have a look around. It's around us, so it's important we have these programs in place for a start. It's something there, you don't just follow it down to every I's dotted, every T's crossed, but you have something there to build something on the prevailing conditions of your own country at the time. And same thing in Australia as well. And no doubt, we got the same thing with some leftists. They look about maybe we'll just change government policy a little bit. Not saying it's actually a systematic problem of the system itself. That's the issue. And we'll just make a few mild reforms, and then, hey, presto, everything's better. For those comrades, we're now on number 34, the Comintern in the colonial world. Now, the highest critical point in the Second Congress of the Communist International was Lenin's resolution on the national and colonial question. This was a thrust powerfully delivered right into one of the most vital organs of capitalism, the colonial system. It was the first time that the world's labour movement, since its inception, had paid major attention to the fate of the gigantic masses of the colonials peoples, and which were. Obviously, there's millions of people at that time that were colonised around the world, Africa, no doubt, Asia, South and Central Americas as well. And there were millions. At times they'd say they outnumbered the proletariat and of the Western countries. So it was actually vitally important. I think actually Marx referred back to even when he was talking about the Irish question. It was on when Ireland was Britain's first colony, and he explained the importance of the Irish being able to be liberated and form their own country, for the workers of of Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales to be liberated. How can we ask for our own liberation, our own power, when oppressed peoples around the world are still cannot succeed? And it's vitally important. And on that, Lenin's thesis on this was vitally important. You had China was kicking off the world that way, and we all know that, and that alone is a huge subject on China. There was certainly they were a colonised people by the British, no doubt other colonial powers as well. And they were fighting back. At the time, the Communist Party of China wasn't formed, but there was certainly the Kuomintang, obviously forming some form of resistance to imperial power, with the Japanese invading as well in that country. China was just a classic example of what was important. But we supported the oppressed peoples around the world for their own liberation. I'll give you another classic example, the Philippines as well, which they're still struggling today. The Filipinos, they had the Spanish, first of all, and then, of course, obviously the US afterwards. Vietnamese is another classic example of that point and the importance of their struggles. So, and even Africa, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, etc., etc. I can name, we could be here all day naming it, but it's important why they did it. And why? Because those people were fighting against the same system as what we were in the imperial countries at the same time. It's okay, imperialism, capitalism, and that they were successful. Those oppressed people were successful. That actually that would weaken imperialism further. Imperialism wouldn't have the ability to dump goods and then make people poor, and that it actually weakened them further. So it's vitally important of tactics, but also it was vitally important to show international solidarity with oppressed peoples around the world. And obviously, I explained what Karl Marx described about that with Ireland as well, in that which goes through this book. And then we obviously social democratic imperialism, which lies on there, but it's vitally important we do have that. Solidarity with oppressed peoples around the world. Today, an example, the Syrian people still struggling against the reaction of US hegemony and through Saudi Arabia and Israel. And of course, we should vitally support them. Actually, proudly to wear the global Syrian Army Defenders of Syria shirt, so I stand in solidarity with them as well. And we should be supporting all those in the Middle East. But the people of Yemen, for example, yes, they do need our support in any way we can give them support. We will give them support. So they were just two kind of primary examples, and there's many more. The people of Venezuela now on their road to socialism as well. That ought to be it. And then the people struggling in Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, and even Brazil. Those they will need our support. We're an international movement, and obviously we support that. But even too in Australia here, for those Australian comrades, the Indigenous people here, they have been fighting it since 1788. And they might be a minority now in the population, but they are the first people of the land, and they've obviously still to this day got major amount of discrimination. Their deaths in custody is still huge. They're highly incarcerated. Poverty and destitution is a reality for them, and so we should support them in their struggle as well. It's vitally important. And Lenin actually outlined that. Actually, Karl Marx outlined that back in the First International as well, why we need to support oppressed peoples around the world. So it's it is part of our struggle to get that, and I'm assuming that so within America as well, with the US, Canada, the native, we Indigenous people will to be supported, but black people, but also other people that have been oppressed as well need to be supported. As Karl Marx correctly said, workers of all countries unite. Black and white unite to fight, and we do need to bring that back in. So it's their struggle is our struggle too. Because we're all, if we think our struggle is completely different from theirs, oh no, they've got their own issues and everything else. We need to just struggle and fight, and then we're certainly going to be very isolated and divided. We need to bring it all together as a concentrated effort against imperialism, capitalism. So that's what Lenin was talking about this when he through this part of this one of the Comintern and the colonial world. The other one is talking about social democratic imperialism. Now, I'll just check my pages. I haven't jumped too far forward. Nope, all good. Marx and Engels transmitted to oncoming generations of workers many great revolutionary principles as the heritage from the First International, but the opportunist leaders of the Second International proceeded to bury them and to try to make the workers forget they ever existed. Among these Marxist principles were those relating to the development of revolutionary national liberation movements. The First International opened the gateway to this great field and struggled the Second International closed it again. The 38 years between the dissolution of the First International and the outbreak of World War I, the period when the Second International War was growing and flourishing, was also the time of the growth and expansion of world imperialism. The era of the First International was one of competitive capitalism. The era of the Second International was that of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. The heyday of the Second International was the time when capitalism was rapidly expanding into all corners of the earth, when the big monopolies became established in the major capitalist countries, when the leading powers finished dividing up the world as their colonial reserves, and when the great national liberation struggles of the vast subjugated peoples of the Far East began to get well underway. It was the era of imperialism. So obviously they needed to obviously fight that, because when we actually were referring back to the aristocracy of labour, also, I understand that a lot of working class people were bought off, not in corrupt forms or anything like that, but there were a lot of gains they did make under their own respective imperialist countries, be it in Britain, in Germany, France, America, and even like all our offshoots here, their satellites of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. There was a lot of gains the workers did make at that time, but unfortunately, the influence of Second International, like for our situation, for King and Empire, then it was the whole thing, and it made those social divisions. So that's why there was an absolute struggle against imperialism to break away. It's not in our interests to maintain imperialism at all. And obviously, there was actually some, even the socialist camp would have said, well, we want our socialism and our colonies at the same time. No, you're not. That would not be socialism at all. You're still oppressing a certain people. But obviously there was a struggle against that, and obviously the communist anti-imperialism. And it goes, as the communists under leadership of Lenin resurrected and redeveloped the general body of revolutionary principles of Marx and Engels, so also specifically they are reapplied in the sense of the new imperialist era, the teachings of the great pioneer theoreticians on the national and colonial questions. Lenin, the greatest of all the anti-imperialists, from the outside of his activities, laid heavy stress upon the question of self-determination for oppressed peoples. And Stalin, his ablest pupil, followed the same course. And just remember too, even under Russian Empire times, when the Tsar was in control there, or the royal family was in control there, Russia was the Russian Empire was made up of all oppressed peoples, so a lot of colonized peoples within that country. So with the flowing on from the revolution, the formation of the USSR, that was also a voluntary union as well for those oppressed peoples. They had their right, if they wished to, make away and form their own country, but that was to be respected as well. That's interesting little foresight about that, because these people were oppressed as well. But watching the Soviet system, they saw the benefits of staying united under a Soviet system to help them enrich their material conditions around them. And obviously from that Communist International, you had the mass anti-imperialist movement in China, began in May 1919, the second phase of the Chinese Revolution. And he said we can talk all day on that one, on that alone, but as I said, we saw how China played an important role, and you had other, and even around the world, you had other struggles against imperialism as well. But China alone was just one classic demonstration. Dustin, do you want to add anything onto that?
Okay, so we just finished with chapter 34. Let me get to the beginning of it. The Comintern in the colonial world. Yeah, Lenin was, I don't know, he's a revolutionary. He's ahead of his time, but his understanding of the national question is like really pivotal to what is still going on today, and what took on later on down the road. And the Russian Revolution respected national minorities within that, and it successfully built a coalition respecting those nations that weren't, the main Russian nation. Build a coalition, built power, took people out of poverty. That's amazing. I mean, just compare that to the United States, where African American people kept in slavery and then moved to cities in the north, and then were kept in neighborhoods, inadequate housing neighborhoods, denied services for years and years to come. And now we see Black Lives Matter is the spontaneous rising of African American people that are exploited, that are given less public services, given the worst jobs, or first fired, last hired. In the United States, we have the Southwest and Chicano people. The same thing. They're giving less services. They have worse jobs. They're more likely to be the victims of police brutality. And this is an international system of imperialism, colonialism that is done to the third world, where colonialism at its key is an extraction of resources from one nation to another. And Lenin, one of the world's greatest revolutionaries, understood this. And if you want to build power for revolutionary, for positive change, you go to where the contradictions are at. You go to what's wrong with the society. You find the people that are at the boot of that, and you mobilize those forces to overthrow and change society for the better. Mm-hmm. And oppressed nations are a big part of that. And Lenin recognized that, and we should still recognize it to this day. So, sorry, gonna give a speech on that, but I'll go right into the next section. 35. We're on chapter 35, page 243. 35. Revolutionary Struggles, Third Congress, 1921. Capitalist and reactionary social democrats on the rise. Many strikes put down. The birth of Italian fascism. Socialist forces got small gains and gave the power to the capitalists. These failures, the failures of forces on the left. Me and David Rovix, people want to check that interview, just talked about his article. I think it's the bullet. It's something about on the trigger and bullets, on triggers and bullets. The failures of the Social Democrats led to the rise of fascism. The failure of the Democrats in the United States to address the hopes that Obama promised have led to Trump and the United States. And that's how it is. A left force, petty bourgeoisie force, opportunist force, refuses to give the needs and the understanding of the people. It maintains the instability in the system. The far right fascist forces take power to maintain stability for the capitalist class. Fascists are the thugs for capitalism. They attack the union. They attack immigrants. They attack anyone seen as an other. And they basically are there to create violence and destruction for the benefit of the capitalist class. Formation of the 2.5 International. That sounds humorous, and it is humorous. The 2.5 International. An amusing attempt to get workers that recognize the faults in the Social Democrats and the right wing to join a group that wasn't as dangerous or as principled or as structured as the Third International. You have problems with the Third International. Maybe you're a labor aristocracy or what have you. Join the 2.5 International. So it's basically just stealing forces that should be going into the Third International, or would be interested in the Third International, because they're mad with the Social Democrats and opportunists. They just make their own and just go off to the side somewhere and just take those forces. The program of the Third Communist International Congress. Lenin remarked, "Progress is not the straight line we expected. There's some setbacks in this period. Capitalism had won, but it was unstable. Capitalism had definitely taken power, but conditions were bad for the workers, and it was an unstable system. Something was going to happen. It couldn't stay as it was for so long. It was either socialism or fascism, and this was the beginning of the rise of fascism. This was also the rise of World War One. Basically, led to the United States as the leader of the imperialist camp. The United States has been the leader of the exploitative imperialist camp since World War One. And this is really where it came to power. And also Japan came to providence and exercised more power in this. So Lenin continues with his statement to the masses, to the masses. This is Lenin in the Third International, at the Third Congress of the Third International in 1921. Get to the masses. That is the source of our political power. The masses are the source of our political power. We analyze these contradictions to address these contradictions. You go to the forces that these contradictions are affecting, to the masses, to the workers. This is where we build our power. This is our power base. Some defeat in Russia, issues with revolts and famines in this period. Before the Russian Revolution, this is not talked about very much. Before the Russian Revolution, there was famines all the time. There was mass starvation. And then, yes, some of these famines continued into the revolutionary period. But the revolution was helping the people. The revolution was bringing people out of poverty. You know, they're trying to address these famines. They're building the infrastructure to make sure these famines don't kill people. But the bourgeois and the capitals like to bring up famines in Russia, but they never bring up the famines that it took place in capitalism before these revolutionary periods. There was famines before the Chinese Revolution in the capitalist era of China. Some organizational questions. So compared to the First and the Second International, there was a common program with definite leadership. They really got on the ball with their structure and their leadership. Democratic socialism, which I talked about before, work among women, right to vote for women. He mentioned William Z. Foster mentioned Frederick Douglass, the great Afro-American civil rights leader, and in my opinion, revolutionary. Was part of the Seneca Falls, upstate New York, which is I live in the South. That's where my family's from. Interesting area. There's a lot of religious cults. That's where the Mormons started, in upstate New York. It's an interesting place of like ideas and understanding for the United States, and it was the start of the women's movement. Frederick Douglass, African American revolutionary, took part in that. In the Soviet Union, women were trained in science and fields where women were never allowed to be a part of. Science, engineering, mathematics. Women were trained in these things and allowed these and given these opportunities that the capitalist world was way behind on women's rights. The Soviet Union was a beacon of hope for women's liberation at the time. Showing that women were capable the same as men in various fields.
Yep.
Interesting, a Kentucky libertarian senator in the United States. I believe it's senator or House of Representatives. I'm not sure. The son of Ron Paul, Rand Paul. Rand Paul said equal pay is something is a dream they made up in the Soviet Union that could never exist in reality. Well, he was kind of right because equal pay did exist in the Soviet Union more than it has even to this day. And the United States is a capitalist country. And even going further, there was women snipers, there was women pilots in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
There was women in the space program later on in the later period. When the United States refused to even consider having women in the space program. These are you had great leaders like Clara Zetkin in the Third International. Bourgeois. Okay, okay. So there's a difference between bourgeois feminism and proletarian feminism. Proletarian feminism is addressing the needs, addressing the whole needs of the workers and the people and the oppressed national question, and making material infrastructure necessary for the rights and liberation of women. And bourgeois feminism is just using feminism for the interests of the bourgeois class, using it as a way of attacking, workers and other things, and guilt trips and so on and so forth, and a bunch of unproductive nonsense that actually has no benefit for the working class or women or women's rights, which the Soviet Union was a beacon of hope. Let's talk about the Democrats in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan, so Iraq, everyone in the United States opposes the Iraq War to the point. There's still some hard people who say, "Oh, it was right. They did have weapons." Some really militant people. But on the most part, the majority of Americans recognize that the Iraq War was a mistake.
Yep.
But the war in Afghanistan, people say, okay, somehow these terrorists from Saudi Arabia, which is an ally of the United States, we had the right to attack Afghanistan because of this attack, which that doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, Afghanistan is the good war. And you have all these feminists, bourgeois feminists. I myself am a feminist. My comrade David Fox is a feminist. We support equal rights for women. But you have these bourgeois feminists who are supporting the war in Afghanistan, and they're backing warlords who are punishing women with acid on their faces with backwards feudal systems. That's Hillary right. Clinton's role in Afghanistan, Hillary Clinton's role in Libya.
Yes.
Destruction. All right. I'll digress. All right. Any response to Section 35?
Look, I think you cover that right well. I think it's about the organisational matters, and obviously, I'll just sort of make a joke about that 2.5 international. I wonder who the 0.5 was at the time. But actually, that came known as the Socialist International later on, or should be correctly says the Non-Socialist International. But obviously, the forces of reaction at the time were trying to formulate, reorganise again. You see it because you actually touched on about the rise of Italian fascism as well, Mussolini. So that was actually in direct response of about capitalism being under threat through that. So I want to talk a little bit about the Red International of Labour Unions. It's widely important too because there was actually a struggle there at that time. Now, the International Federation of Trade Unions it was organised in skeleton form in 1913. There were basis of that, but obviously with the outbreak of World War I, it was basically a shadow of its former self. So there was obviously organisation once that second half international, and then to reform it again. That was so it can counterise proper working class organisation against the overthrow of capitalism. They wanted to actually organise it again so it just maintain the rule of capitalism, basically. And guys, while basically they were trying to manoeuvre, they had leading figures like yourselves in the US Gompers leading it. It was very anti-communist by that time. And along with other well-known, Samuel Gompers, yep, and you had Appleton from England, and I guess from Belgium and Holland, and John and Leon, Joel Hall from France. The enemy of trade unions, Germany. Obviously, Germany wasn't exactly welcome in, but they were certainly allowed to affiliate. So that was still this whole thing of keeping us identified with the bourgeoisie of our own respective countries at the time. Obviously, the Russian trade unions refused to participate in the Amsterdam Congress when this was formed. For obvious reasons, I don't need to explain at the time, because obviously what they wanted to try and do is have a counter to Soviet power here. That's what they were trying to do. So it was a league of centrists, opportunists, employers, etc., and those who were bought off by the capitalist system. That was the way it was trying to marry all our interests back with our respective capitalists, and not trying to actually say, well, they're trying to understand our revolutionary potential and our historical role of overthrowing capitalism. I'll just read this little bit out. It's on page 251, top paragraph. It goes, meanwhile, the Social Democratic trade union leaders were manoeuvring, with Gompers in the lead, to make themselves part of the Imperialist League of Nations, then being born at Versailles. Gompers, an official member of the US government delegation, keep that in mind, government and delegation, was made chairman of the Peace Conference's Commission on International Labour Legislation. In January 1919, as a result of the so-called Labour Convention was adopted based on the AFL's Labour Program of Reconstruction. The program had called for the establishment of a World Labour Parliament. But instead, the League Convention provided for the International Labour Organisation, ILO, which is still around today, a body formed of representatives of governments, employers and workers. Why would you want to have employers on a so-called working class organisation? Based on class collaboration and the permanency of capitalism, that's why they were forming all this, the ILO was made an official part of the League. Therefore, through the years, it proceeded to meddle in the class struggle all over the world to the detriment of the workers. It exists to this day, having been absorbed as part of the machinery of the United Nations, the sole leftover of the old League. The USSR and the Soviet trade unions, although affiliated to the ILO since 1930, only recently became active in that body. So just on that formation, it was there to protect the permanency of capitalism. The capitalist class knew they were under threat, following the footsteps of the Russian Revolution and the revolt of workers and oppressed peoples around the world. So they needed to have something to maintain it. And they wanted to actually put the influence. No, capitalism's here to stay forever. And no doubt, we all would have heard that argument after the deliberate dismantling of the USSR back in 1991. Oh, well, socialism, and that was a great idea, but that doesn't work. It was a failed experiment, blah, blah, blah. Capitalism is the highest stage, everything else. You would have, and all the comrades would have heard that throughout the 1990s, and we still do to this day. And you hear some socialism doesn't work. This is the idea, because capitalism is trying to keep its permanency here. It knows it's going to go out of being. It's on the nose with everyone, regardless if people are aware of it or not. It is on the nose everywhere. It can no longer provide anything anymore. So hence why at that particular time, and what they're trying to do now, you can see there's interesting parallels here. Not exactly identical, but they're certainly interesting parallels of what capitalism will try and do. So yes, of course, labour movement is something we'll come and recognise you, my dear man. Yes, we'll give you a few concessions, my dear man. Yes, but yeah, your interest lies with us. And no doubt class collaboration throughout that 20th century. It's time and time again. We've all seen it before. So it's obviously that was the whole gist of that as well. It was to stop the working class fulfilling their revolutionary potential, reaching their revolutionary potential. Now, the foundation of the RILU, which is the Red International Labour Unions, was while the right-wing labour movement was taking steps to re-establish the International Federation, the left wing was no less active in regrouping its trade union forces. Lenin, with his penetrating mind, early understood that the great split caused by the war treason of the revisionists and their counter-revolutionary attitude was bound also to involve the World Trade Union movement. And just on the splits, let's remember who really actually caused that splits at the time, were the revisionists, the right opportunists, and that. It wasn't the left wing or AKA the communists, the Marxists that caused it. All that time, they always seek to have unity with workers from all spectrums of life and walks of life. So that's always keeping that in mind. And like we're going back to left wing communism, we don't need to split. Let them. We should be always looking to have unity amongst workers everywhere. So that obviously that was the importance of that forming to have I actually would say it is a proper international trade union movement at the time, not one based on class collaboration, but one based on class struggle. No way to move forward. Now, obviously, at the time we got the program of the ILU, which needed to formed, and obviously anything that needs to be formed needs to have some sort of program. We don't just get together for the hell of it and think, oh, this is all a great idea. We need to have something we can an established program we can work from moving forward. And so the program of the Red International Labour Unions, or Profintern, as it was often called, as contained in its constitution, proposed to organise the world workers for the overthrow of capitalism and establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's the fundamental difference between that and the International Federation of Trade Unions. It was there for the overthrow of capitalism, where the International Federation of Trade Unions was there to maintain the rule of capital. So that's obviously it supported policies of class struggle and opposed class collaboration took a stand against the International Labour Office and the International Federation of Trade Unions, and naturally it would do that as well, but also expose it for what it really is, and those class collaborators. We had them here too in this country. And I was they made themselves well known during the 1950s period. I will talk more about the Cold War side of things, but obviously looked at someone like Samuel Gompers. But he was one of many. He wasn't the only one. There was a classic example of that. Shaping the RILU program at the Congress in the development of the program, the tactics of the new International Labour Centre. There were only two serious disputes. One of these was over the question of left-wingers working within the old conservative trade unions. There were several leftist groups at the Congress, from the American IWW, the French and Spanish anarcho-syndicalists, the German KPD, etc. And they firmly supported the sectarian idea of the left-wing elements withdrawing from the old unions to establish independent revolutionary organisations with policies, structures and leadership designed to their own liking. This was one of the major expressions of left sectarianism that Lenin had waged a war against in the Second Comintern Congress. And we talked about left-wing communism before. The importance, we can't go doing that. Because if you start doing that, comrades start doing that, trying to form these pure organisations, and that they're not going nowhere. I can guarantee that. It's been done over and over and over time. And I think we've all got to ask ourselves, when is everyone going to learn? Yeah, we don't learn that way. We need to be, as to go back to that thing, it's not a left-wing, right-wing argument. It's class struggle, workers against capital for the overthrow of capital. That's why it's important to even unite with those workers in conservative unions. Dual revolutionary unionism was something of a new ideological deviation in Europe, say in the anarcho-syndicalist circles, but it had a long history in the case of American IWW, SB&E, SLP. For 15 years, these organisations had encouraged the policy of pulling militant elements out of the mass AFL unions, to the great detriment of the latter. Leftists of the IRLU Congress made a fight for their line, but the delegates overwhelmingly supported the Leninist trade union principle, left-wingers remaining inside the ranks of the organised trade unions, and they're fighting for their class struggle program. And and actually it's a good book too. We do remain in those organisations for the simple reason we learn to actually develop our struggle better. We learn from whatever mistakes we learn, because you're not going to learn anything by ourselves or divided from the masses or totally isolated. The only way we're going to learn moving forward in class struggle is we learn our abilities and how we can win. And how we can win, how we can achieve to get to a higher level of struggle. So that it's vitally important to know that. Obviously, through that, it didn't say the Red International Labour Unions didn't say come without its problems. Obviously, we just saw one classic example there. You had deviations of all things, right and left. But that's all part of it. But if all of a sudden we start splitting off, once again, this is why it's important. Workers of all countries unite. And all Karl Marx said, we need to have that unity. So in that way, we develop our struggle and our programs out of that as well. And yeah, we saw that. The AFL, we've seen it here in Australia where they try to split and not just let those unions they split from either collapse completely or just go exist in some sort of form or the other, but wasn't developing those struggles further. The new revolutionary unionism, with the development of the Leninist type of unionism expressed by the RILU, raised the whole labour movement to a new and higher levels of efficiency than they had been attained at the time of the dominance of the Second International. The trade unions were infused with a better fighting spirit, and they were given a clearer leadership perspective as against the paralysing class collaboration and semi-bourgeois outlook cultivated by the reformists. They were also infused with a stronger sense of class unity and political solidarity, in contrast to the narrow craft unionism and neutralist ideas characteristic of reformist unionism. Now, on that, I'm going to give you some classic examples of that. Now, the reason why that needed to be formed, because as I said, the old federation was pretty much devoid of anything. It's now completely decaying. And honestly, when you have a look during the time of the Second International, if we had a proper united trade union movement around the world playing an active role in class struggle, I don't even think, well, one would have went very far. It'd be lucky some shot side if workers were prepared to go and strike and turn those guns around against their workers. And that's what's quite vitally important. And in Australia, here, for example, those unions that were affiliated through that, the Red International Labour Unions, which eventually became the World Federation of Trade Unions, played active roles. The waterfront unions played active roles in international affairs. The Seamen's Union, the Waterside Workers Federation, the Deckhands Union, the Painters and Dockers, etc., and even the metals unions. We played a very important role, and this is why it's more important an active role internationally. A classic example, when the Indonesians were fighting for independence from Dutch colonial control. This is where it's important about supporting oppressed peoples. What did the workers do here, especially on the waterfront? Refuse to load and unload Navy ships, refused to untie them. They had to actually get the name, and especially Dutch ships. That's what I was saying. Refused to load and unload Dutch carriers, the whole lot. They'd actually crippled it. The important role of the working class here in that as well. During the Vietnam War, there was a classic example against the anti-conscription. Unions played a huge role in that because of the international outlook on it. And this is why it's important. We have a united union movement that can play an important role, and even just not so long in history, a lot of unions here in this country played a good role in the establishment of the independence for East Timor, or Timor-Leste from Indonesia. Obviously, I won't go into the whole history of that, but that was vitally important in there as well. So, and also helping other workers around the world as well. So, if there happened to be a strike in America, for example, and we were dealing with the same companies that the workers were striking against, bang, we'd have a strike here as well against it, one way or the other, or all the goods and that would have been locked up on the waterfront, or the railway workers refused to transport or truck drivers refused to transport their freight. So it gives you a bit of an example of what that was all about. But the importance there just shows our international, that as working class, we are an international, and yeah, we're the only, as I said, the only thing we've got to lose is our chains, and that's what we to do. And so it showed you through that period of the new revolutionary unionism. And the last time that ever was shown, interesting enough, is during Karl Marx's time, during the American Civil War period. The unions then played a very important role in defeating the Confederacy. So that just showed you this is the reason why the importance of having a revolutionary program with the unions as well, not just with making a few minor reforms within the system and everything like that without pertaining capital. So, did you want to add anything onto that, Gus?
On the very last page of that section, 256, read. I'm just reading a quote. The Communist International use every instrument within its control to compel the trade unions to admit Negro workers to membership.
Yes.
Basically, the Communist International has been, was militantly in support of African American people to be able to join unions, and against the opportunists, the racist opportunists who weren't allowing them to join the Communist International, that recognizes that it gets its power. The communists get their power from the workers and oppressed peoples and masses, and they have to be allowed into the union. And it's been communists and the International that has, from material basis, from solidarity, not charity, but from an own self-interest in their own power, has been the forefront of fighting for the rights of African-American peoples and oppressed nations.
Exactly. And just on that, I don't know if you ever watched the movie Make One. It came out 1987. Actually, I have it on DVD. I recommend it for everyone to read that. It was about the coal mine strike in West Virginia, 1920. But it showed you there, first of all, the race divisions between Black American and white American, but that are like said, but they all united together. And interesting, where the term redneck came from the coal miners of the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia. They wore the red bandanas around their neck, and everything else, but the black and white, they all were. That was the term. It was the blood of the worker, the red, and fighting against the boss is a basic thing. So so only those comrades. I don't know if you've watched it yourself, Dust, but I highly recommend if you get a copy of that, Make One, Matewan. I recommend that watching. It's quite a good movie.
All right, thank you. I'll go on to the next section. We're on page 257, chapter 37, the United Front, Fourth Congress, 1922. I'll just get right into my notes. This was Lenin's last Congress. He said, let's see, what happened? Okay, I'm not seeing it. Oh yeah, it was. On May 26th, he had his 1922 had a stroke and caused his death. So this was Lenin's last Congress. Lenin and labor unity. Unite all forces possible to achieve workers' demands against the capitalist attacks. The Berlin Conference of the Three Internationals. The 2.5 International use calls to unity to attack the Soviet Union. This is the time period where there's a lot of tax on working people. There's a lot of tax on labor. So Lenin had a call for unity. The United Front, get as many workers in as possible, unite with as many powers as possible, defend the workers, defend the rights of the workers. And the 2.5 International, the reformists, the opportunists, they were like, okay, we'll unite with you. They had a conference, and all they did was use that conference to attack the Soviet Union because they're scared of the Soviet Union because of their class interests. The Fourth World Comintern Congress. Did I write that down right? Yes, the Fourth World Comintern Congress, lowering conditions, attack on workers, rise of capitalism. The policy of the United Front. The right is with the bosses. Okay, so the right wing, the right opportunists are with the bosses. Right? So these right opportunists, the bourgeois, liberal, fake leftists, whatever you want to call them, they're with the interests of the bosses. What is it for us to do? Go to the masses. That is where our power is at. Go to the masses.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we derive our political power. Again, the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles impoverished workers, led to the rise of Hitler. So in Germany, the bourgeois forces should have opposed it more forcefully, because the bourgeois weren't worried about it, because they were just going to take the money that was being extorted by the English and the people who won World War I. They were just going to take that money from the workers and give it to them. So the petty bourgeois in Germany didn't fight hard enough against this treaty. And then the petty bourgeois in Europe was like, ooh, we're getting money from the German workers. Why would we oppose this?
Mm-hmm.
But the communists, the social order, fought against the Treaty of Versailles. And it was actually the inability of the German Social Democrats to oppose the imposition of the Treaty of Versailles, war reparations, that helped bring Hitler to power. Any response to Section 37?
Let's see. Just going through it. Well, I think at that time, really, I think there was still a lot of upheavals happening around, and massive strike waves happening through Europe and around the world, and obviously the material conditions. So the capitalist class still felt themselves under threat all the time, especially in Germany. Rise of Hitler as well, with called the Treaty of the Versailles. They sort of put some really imposing conditions on the German bourgeoisie, but it was also willing to get back to being a huge imperial power again for German capital. The workers, there were strike waves after strike waves. So obviously, bourgeoisie, especially in Germany, would have seen themselves under threat, the potential. I mean, Luxembourg and Kreuzberg might have been off the scene by then, but still there was the potential of the growing Communist Party. They've seen that as a threat. And we saw that through the 1920s, the growing influence of the Communist Party of Germany at the time in there. So it was around the world. it was a worldwide thing with the advent of fascism in Italy as well. That was certainly obviously this is where, and actually I'll just pull up a minute, 2 steps back. And also what we keep in mind, actually a lot of our capitalist governments at the time were looking towards Mussolini as a model. And also when Hitler eventually did come to rise as well, they actually praised the fascists. From everything from our traditional heads of state, from the royal family right through to various US presidents, prime ministers, etc., throughout the capitalist world, was actually making praise on the fascists. Oh, you can keep the communists down. What a great way of doing it as well, and quietly supporting it. And I won't go down too long, because we'll go on to chapter 38. I want to make sure, but keep in mind too, we're going to talk about fascism as we progress through this book as well. Partial stabilisation, the 5th Congress, 1924. Did you want me to break the news about those 2 chapter 38s?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just, comrades, just to be aware, there was a misprint in this book. Obviously, if you see it, number 38, I don't know if you can see it, number 38, that one, but if you actually, a few pages forward on page 270, there's also chapter 38. I put a circle around that, so just make sure that's chapter 39. There was a misprint. So if any of you guys have got this book and you want to hang on, what's going on here? Yeah, then I've only Dust pointed out to me this morning. I've never actually didn't notice that before. So yeah, there you go. Partial stabilisation, the 5th Congress, 1924. This is the 5th World Congress of the Communist International was held in Moscow from the June 17th to July 8th, 1924. This was the first Comintern Congress without the leadership of Lenin, the world proletarian leader, having died 6 months before on the 21st of January at the age of 54. Sadly, the delegates from 52 countries marched to the Red Square behind a Red Army band to pay their respects to the great Lenin, who lay at rest before the Kremlin wall. President Kalinin and the Congress delegates spoke. Lenin delivered mighty blows for exploited humanity against the obsolete and decadent capitalist system. In the field of theory, he re-established the revolutionary principles of Marx and then developed them to meet the changed conditions of the imperialist era. And in the realm of practice, he had led the vital Russian Revolution, which tore away a whole segment of the most basic foundations of the capitalist system. Under his direct leadership, the workers of the world were well started on the road to socialism. All the power of the capitalist exploiters with their flocks of right social democrat flunkies never undo or offset the revolutionary work performed by the great proletarian leader, Lenin. And yeah, so that was handed at that time as well. So he sadly missed at the age of 54. I've had a number of discussions with comrades over the years if Lenin continued to live a few more years or lived all that. Look, you know, that's another discussion another time. But at that time, there's another important event between the 4th, 5th Congress of the Comintern was a consolidation of the 2nd and 2.5 internationals. The fusion took place in Hamburg in May 1923. There were present some 400 delegates of the 2 internationals, claiming to represent 6,700,000 members and 43 parties in 30 countries. The organised body became known as the Labour and Socialist International and set up headquarters in Zurich. Frederick Adler was chosen as secretary, and Oud Geest, secretary of the Amsterdam Trade Union International, was president and gave his blessing to the fusion. It was formed through essentially on the basis of the revisionist program of the 2nd International. So hence it was once again trying to revive the old 2nd International under a new name, the Labour, and give it a more of an, you could say a socialist name, yet a more appealing name to the working class, the Labour and Socialist International. But obviously, the discussions from there would have been from their respective interests of their own imperialist masters and all that. At the time, I was not talking about working class unity around the world, workers of all countries unite, and how we're going to defeat the capitalist system. In January, also of that year too, was the October defeat in Germany. In order to wring reparations out of a resistant Germany, France suddenly sent troops into the industrial region of the Ruhr. Now, for those who understand what the Ruhr was, there's actually a lot of coal was mined from there. Big coal mining section of Germany that they depended on. The violent French action provoked an near war crisis and also greatly inflamed the current fantastic inflation. The coup likewise generated a revolutionary mood amongst the workers. The German Communist Party and the Comintern agreed that the revolutionary situation was at hand. In May, the communists initiated strikes in the Ruhr, and on August 11th, the General Works Council, under the communist influence, called for a general strike. The workers took over the cities of Bochum and Gelsenkirchen. I do apologise, there's some long words there. The Second International refused to cooperate with the Comintern, surprise, surprise, to protect the rural workers. During the next days, the rebellious workers forced out the National Bourgeoisie Kuhnau government and a coalition government headed by Stresemann and included the Social Democrats, Hilferding, Solomon and Radbruch. Took its place. The role of the Social Democrats was, as usual, to save the threatened capitalist system. And just on that, relations between, in Germany in particular, relations between communists and social democrats were extremely sour. More so than even probably, more so than any other country around the world. Actually, social democrats used to organise killing communists. These weren't just punch-up street fights in pubs and clubs and everything else. These were like, kill people. So, obviously, and also social democrats, I understand, who were actually on the forefront of actually murdering Luxembourg and the others through the Front Corps as well. So, yeah, there was especially toxic tensions there amongst the two camps. And obviously you saw throughout Germany, through Hamburg, workers rose and fought heroically for several days after October 23rd in an insurrection, but isolated, they were eventually crushed. Thousands were jailed once again thanks to the right social democrats. The German Revolution was defeated and reaction given to the victory. The treason stimulated fascism, not only in Germany, but all throughout Central Europe. So the reason why it's stimulated, because the capitalist class realised it was under threat. Even that, so they needed to do something. So they would have obviously sponsored a lot of fascist movements throughout Germany and throughout Central Europe as well. Obviously, also the Congress and Partial Capitalist Stabilisation. The Fifth Congress of the Communist International Congress made a penetrating analysis of the economic and political situation then confronting the workers of the world. On the one hand, it noted that the workers in Soviet Russia had the situation well in hand and were beginning to move ahead to the reconstruction of the war-shattered economy. The delegates, however, showed much concern over the concretely repudiated developing Trotsky opposition, which, upon the death of Lenin, was becoming malignantly active. And just now we'll try to talk a little bit more about the Trotskyist opposition through that, but obviously through that time it was talk about giving biding their time and becoming organised as well. The capitalists on their side have succeeded in beating back the new revolutionary wave in Germany and administered a number of serious defeats to the workers in other countries. Obviously, a great revolutionary moment in Europe that had followed World War I had just about spent itself, and the capitalists aided on all fronts of the by social democracy for the time being, at least, have managed to save their social system. You can see all these upheavals happening around it, and Germany being central to it all, being a major economic power. It was rather important because there's saying if a revolution was successful in Germany, certainly the conversation now would be totally different. And it certainly would have been a big boost in the arm for the world communist movement, for the international working class, actually, to be honest with you. There was, if revolution was successful in there. The question of the United Front, and we'll explain a little bit of that. In accordance with the enormous importance of the political tactic, the Fifth Congress devoted close attention to the whole matter of the United Front, both in theory and in practice. And the heart of the discussion was the ill-fated experience in Saxony and Thuringia 8 months before. The debate was carried on in a spirit of self-criticism. At this Congress, the term Marxism-Leninism was first used in recognition of Lenin's enormous theoretical contributions to Marxism. And well, obviously, I had a look at all about forming United Fronts. Obviously, this was when the first time prior to when fascism was starting to become a threat. And obviously now the importance of having a United Front activity. The Congress resolution stressed the point that this was a mobilisation of the workers for a revolutionary struggle and not a lowering of communist aims to the level of social democratic opportunism. So that was of the importance of their being ready to be organised. Even back then, those comrades were looking at this is now a potential threat to everyone, or fascism, and which we'll explain further in this book. Now, the Bolshevization of the communist parties Continuing on, at the 5th Congress, at the other Congress meetings, the CI executive special attention was directed to the Bolshevisation of affiliated parties. This implied the development of these parties on the principles Lenin's party of the new type. Among other elementary measures, it involved the reorganisation of the party units upon the basis of the shops, the carrying on the work of all forms of undemocratic countries, in all forms in undemocratic countries, the cultivation of the spirit of self-criticism, the firm correction of all errors, right and left, and the systematic raising of the ideological level of the party membership, the building of a strong party unity, and the cultivation of a clear-headed, flexible, and realistic Marxist-Leninist leadership. And obviously, there was a lot of parties then were wanting to affiliate to the Third International, Communist International. Actually, the party in the US at the time, I think there was two, I'm led to believe, but one of them wanted to affiliate, and but obviously they wanted to exclude black workers out of unions and out of that, and that was actually against common terms. So they said, no, you can't do that. You're not affiliating until such time you correct that, make that correction. And I think that, and also too, in Australia here, 1920, there was a split in the early 20s. Two communist parties, and for them both to affiliate in that, they had to consolidate, rectify certain mistakes, and form one Australian Communist Party of Australia, or then known as the ACP, Australian Communist Party. So, and also it's also too, although the revolutions were, the trade unions were coming into being, it's also making sure it's a higher level of form of struggle. It's not just based on trade unionism. No, it was actually based on working class ideology. And I'll just, without going off train, there's a little bit difference of trade union consciousness and a class consciousness. Trade union consciousness is very limited if we're looking at that way. It only looks at within trying to fight for immediate demands within the capitalist system. You know, wages, conditions, and other improvements in workers' lives, which are important. And stop it. What class consciousness and what kind of revolutionary class consciousness is raise the workers to a conscious state? It's the system itself that needs to be overthrown. We as workers can take power and run the system and run our own system. We don't need, basically the bosses need us. We don't need them. We can actually live in a world with no bosses at all. So that's just putting the gist of it. Now, before we move to number 39 or 38 Mark II, Dustin, do you want to say anything on that?
Those great points. I think I'll go right into 39. It's getting late. It's like we're going on 3 hours into this. I think we'll end it with 39. Like I'll do 39, and then you'll respond, and then I'll have a few ending notes. So page 27. Okay. So page 270. It says 38. It's actually 39. And I also want to finish this section because if we tell people we're starting on 39 and there's no 39, they might get confused for next week. So we're going to end it on this section. I'll go right into my notes on 39. 39, class collaboration and class struggle, 1924 to 1928. There's growing stability of capitalism, but there's increasing tensions amongst the imperialist forces. It's basically the build up to World War II. And the AFL, the Reactionary Opportunist Labor Union, is pushing the policy of isolationism, which is don't fight the Nazis. The rationalization of industry. Henry Ford, I don't want to call him a revolutionary, but he made drastic changes to the industrialized system with the assembly line. And a lot of it, so they raised Henry Ford when he, so his wages were like 2 or 3 times that of normal wages of other workers. But they started producing hundreds and hundreds of more with the assembly line, and it was essentially speed up. It put workers out of work because it transitioned from smaller artisan shops to the assembly line. It put workers out of work, and it sped up those workers, and it made those, like, if you're on assembly line, it's the same meaningless task over and over again. It leads to all kind of psychological and health and problems. This is the 1920s. This is the Gilded Age. This is where Wall Street is doing great. Amazing things are being created, large skyscrapers and cities, and the car, but people are in horrible conditions. The Gilded Age. There was a British strike. Workers stood up. They were backed by the Comintern. The Russians actually gave money to the strikers. The Russian people, the Soviet Union, took a portion of their wages to give to the striking British workers. That's incredible. A country, a nation, the government of a country agreed, and the people agreed that we need to help our brothers and sisters that are having this hard time, and gave them part of their wages. I mean, that's inspiring. That's the definition of the international working class movement. I mean, it was ultimately defeated, and there was backlash against that, because then they said, it's not. Then there was this whole national chauvinism thing about, oh, you guys are just puppets of the Russians or whatever, and it had a bad offense. But I mean, it was a beautiful act of solidarity. There was revolutionary struggles in China. So there's this whole thing between the KMT and the communists. The International, the Comintern, or Lenin, and decided that it was in the best interest of the International to support an alliance in the policy of the United Front between the KMT and the communists. And I think that was positive, and that was the necessary, but the KMT ended up backstabbing the communists.
Yes.
Because they were jealous of the power of the communists to organize the workers and to organize the peasants. Well, mostly the peasants in China, but there was a backlash against it. I mean, later on, Mao and the communists ultimately come to power. The fight against the Trotsky, Zinoviev, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce these, Zinoviev, Buckingham opposition, or Bukharin opposition. Trotsky proven time again to be an opportunist, petty bourgeois. This was the struggle of socialism in one country. Stalin said we should build up our socialism in one country. We should build up productive forces. We should keep a base on our power. And Trotsky was ready to go to war with the world, destabilize, destroy the Soviet Union. We need a global permanent revolution everywhere. It would have been disastrous, and it would have been bloodshed and disgusting. Like, this is pure ultra leftism. This is also the time where Stalin wrote, in the midst of improving and building up Russian and having battles with Trotsky, Stalin wrote The Foundations of Leninism. And this right here is my foundations of understanding Marxist Leninism. And it's so, like, it was written this revolutionary time period, but it's so applicable today. It's amazing. I'm doing an audio book of that. I haven't finished it. I got the introduction and the first two up. I'll get back around to it. If people want to listen to the audio book of the first few sections of that. Any response to chapter 39?
Yeah, look, I think it's you covered most of it, and I think you look at Trotsky's role, and forming the left opposition was with all these minorities. I mean, I was just jokingly, he's really coming out to be the forefront of the whole movement of being a serial pest, an international serial pest by the looks of it. But yeah, it just on top of that, look, it's interesting because a lot of people that say they're in their Trotskyist groups or they work and follow Trotsky even thought that Trotsky should have been the leader after Lenin. They never actually, a lot of them never read Permanent Revolution. I had painstakingly read it once. I didn't want to, but I had to, just so get an idea what the hell was going on. What it basically stipulates is we'll hold off having revolution here and socialism here in Russia. We'll hold off because these other countries have got to have revolution first. And basically, how's that ever way to work? So 3 o'clock next Thursday afternoon, Germany will have its revolution by then, and then we'll wait for France to step in after that, probably Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock, etc. Then by over the weekend, we will have socialism. So it's just ridiculous. Actually, we've been a few comrades nicknamed Permanent Revolution, permanent procrastination. It wasn't. It was just basically based on some sort of ideal. It was idealist. It totally distorted what Marx and Engels talked about a revolution as well. It's not Marxism. It was a diversion away from it, and I think it was just interesting because when I hear the Trotskyist groups, Soviet Union wasn't real socialism and all this other things. Like they know, they of course, because they're the professionals of everything and they know how to do it all. Well, okay, but the fact is, at the end of the day, they've never actually read that book and understand where it was coming from. And it basically and Stalin ripped that to pieces. And Trotsky could never admit his mistake in writing it. And so, as Caleb actually correctly pointed out, Trotsky's a sort of one. He romanticised the Western industrial powers like France and Germany, no doubt, New York. He would have been suited in the streets of Paris or in a cafe with some other intellectuals having coffee, having a debate about some sort of minute thing. But that's the sort of character was. He was hostile to the peasantry. Something must have happened in his younger years between him and the peasantry, but also too of his class background as well. And obviously, he never was going to address those incorrections and correct himself. So, and obviously, as history proven, he was wrong. Completely wrong, and let himself do all sorts of trouble at that time as well. But obviously, look, we're going to come across all sorts of people with ideas and theories and that throughout we're trying to struggle for socialism. And look, Trotsky wasn't new to this; it's something ever, but it's an important thing we'd have a look at. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much summarised what I've got to say about that. But it's a really good history. There's a lot more we could say, but it is getting late. When I went before, I looked at the time. It's now just after 1 o'clock here in Australia, so it's nearly just after 11 o'clock your time, I'm led to believe, in the night. So, yeah, we can leave it off, and next time we'll continue on with the 40th chapter, the Communist International Program, 6th Congress of 1928.
Right on. So, are you free the next 2 weeks to finish this?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so folks still on here, join us next week at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the United States. What's that in Australia?
10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
10 o'clock, a day ahead of time.
Yes,
Monday. So join us next week. We'll be starting on page 278 with number 40. All right. Have a good night. Well, good morning over there.
See you next time.
Yeah.